everybody wearing the masks. It's a little uncomfortable, but it's probably the right thing to do, and I appreciate that. If you want to take it off to speak, feel free to do so. And I'd like to thank the Joint Base Cape Cod staff for coming tonight and explaining their project to us, and also the Rosemary Carey and her group, the 350 group, and they're going to be speaking afterwards. So I'd like to remind everybody to please be cordial tonight. We're going to have widely divergent points of view, but let's be respectful, make our point in a clear way without, getting too fired up and angry. Try to be, peaceful. What we were going to make? Oh, I'd like to know if anybody's recording other than FCTV. If you could just announce that, please. And WCAI, thank you. Anybody else? Okay. So this is recorded. It's broadcast live on FCTV as well. If we could, I'd like to start this evening with a moment of silence to honor the people we've lost today in Afghanistan. At least 12 Marines and 15 wounded. So I'm very sorry for that. And let's take a moment of silence, please. Thank you very much. Please remember that we're limiting individual public comment to 3 minutes. If there's additional time and people want to speak again later, if they have further thoughts, that's probably going to be okay. It doesn't look like we have a packed house. And so with that, if there's nothing else from the board. Right, when you want to speak, if you could please take your time and come down to here. And if people want to queue up a couple in a row, keep a little distance between ourselves, but we will ask everyone to speak at the microphone so you can be recognized on the camera. Anything else I've missed? Right, and comments should be directed to the chair, so we're not bantering back and forth between each other, and they will be addressed just the same. And with that, I'll turn it over to Colonel Porter and the staff from Joint Base Cape Cod. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Colonel Matthew Porter. I'm the garrison commander at Camp Edwards, so that's the Army side of which is the northern 15,000 acres, as well as the couple thousand acres in the cantonment. I'm also the full-time base manager as well. I won't try to confuse you with what that means, but essentially I'm there every day of the week. With me today is Ben Gregson. Ben, to my left here, he is the POC, the main person running the groundwater cleanup program for the Army. I've got Jake McCumber, who is our natural resource director for the on the Army side. And then we got Alex McDonough over there, Major Alex McDonough. He runs my plans and training. He's also been part of this range project since its inception. And then down in the bullpen down there, we have Mr. Keith Driscoll with those flowing curly locks right there. He does our MIPA and our NEPA environmental work. And then we have Dr. Mike Sorenka, who runs our Environmental Resource Center. So I'm extremely happy to be here tonight. I'm glad, I appreciate the invite from the Select Board, and hopefully we can get a lot of important information, which I know a lot of you have been eager to learn about our programs, the range, and so forth. With that, I'd like to start off with a little bit of a brief history, starting roughly around the community working group time, through the NPMG, and then a couple comments on the EPA sole source aquifer review as well at the end. So in 1998, the community working group, chaired by Mary McConnell, now the current chair of the EMC Community Advisory Council, was formed and charged with developing a land use master plan for the MMR, now known as JBCC. The result of this working group were a set of guiding principles, which would set the foundation for the final area-wide environmental impact report, known as FEIR, and its corresponding certificate signed by Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs in July 2001. The FEIR served as a foundational document for the establishment of the Chapter 47 Acts of 2002 and put into motion the establishment of the Advisory Council, the Environmental Management Commission and its two advisory councils, the Science Advisory Council and the Community Advisory Council. The EMC, made up of the northern 15,000 acres of Camp Edwards, also known as the Upper Cape Water Supply Reserve, um, ensuring that any actions that take place in this reserve comply with Chapter 47 of the 19 Environmental Performance Standards. Chapter 47 dedicates the Upper Cape Water Supply Reserve for the use and training of the military, provided the military training is compatible with the natural resource purposes of the water supply and the wildlife protection. The Mass Army National Guard has continued to comply with the laws, regulation, processes, EPSs, the guiding principles which started with the Community Working Group in 1998, and since 2006 have returned to live fire on some of the small arms ranges. In 2015, the EPA closed out its investigation on the small arms ranges operable units, stating that the small arms ranges are not currently a source of any significant groundwater contamination. In 2017, the EPA modified Administrative Order Number 2, recognizing the EMC as the oversight authority of Camp Edwards small arms ranges, and lifted the prohibition of lead ammunition firing in the reserve with EMC approval. On June 30th, Mr. Ray Jack from East Falmouth petitioned the EPA to conduct a sole source aquifer review relating to the MPMG project and whether the proposed range has a potential to contaminate the aquifer, creating a significant hazard to public health. We are as dedicated to the quality of the groundwater as Mr. Jack. In 2020, the Mass Army National Guard requested that the EPA determine whether this review was required, and were told by the EPA that we are exempt. We welcome the EPA's detailed review under the Sole Source Aquifer program and have already reached out and been in contact with their team. The EPA has been heavily involved with all things relating to groundwater and the aquifer since 1997, with extensive regulatory authority and oversight. We work closely with them, the Mass DEP, the Environmental Management Commission, and we are confident in the regulatory and scientific processes and the findings to date. With that, like I said, I think it was important just to kind of put some things in context before we begin. And I'd like to introduce Major Alex McDonough, and he'll begin the briefing. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Again, my name's Major Alex McDonough. I'm the Plans, Training, Mobilization, and Security Officer. That means I'm in charge of all the training that takes place. I oversee range design in terms of a planning phase. And today we're going to be talking about the multipurpose machine gun range, its proposed location, and its purpose. So to start this brief, I'd like to orient you to Joint Base Cape Cod, and specifically the Northern Training Area, or the Upper Cape Water Supply Reserve. This is identified by the green border on the figure to the right. The figure to the left highlights the range complex and shows the figure used in our analysis for potential locations for the multipurpose machine gun range. From the 1940s to now, over 1,000 acres of Joint Base Cape Cod were used for ranges. Currently, approximately 33 acres of land are used for operational ranges. At the time of the EPA's administrative orders, we used over 400 acres for active ranges. As military use of the base has changed from World War II to now, so has the use of live fire ranges on the installation. So again, for the folks in the crowd, the figure to the left circled has the old KD range, and the figure to the right has two ranges, the KD range on the southern side and Sierra range, which is one of our operational ranges on the northern side. For this slide, I would like to orient you to the two images to your right. First image on the upper right-hand corner is an overlay of the proposed multipurpose machine gun range. The image at the lower right-hand of the screen is an aerial image of the south side of our current rifle range and demonstrates how habitat returns as range use changes. All soldiers in the Army must complete several core and job-specific training events annually in order to meet training requirements and be eligible for promotion opportunities. Live fire ranges are used in conjunction with simulated training to ensure that soldiers can effectively engage targets and build confidence that their assigned weapon functions correctly in a standardized, timed scenario. The multipurpose machine gun range is a range used to meet the basic annual qualification requirements for soldiers that are assigned the M249 light machine gun and the M240 Bravo medium machine gun. In order for soldiers to progress to more advanced ranges, they must first qualify on this range. Typically, this activity is accomplished within the 24 days allocated for individual training annually and feeds into the 2-week annual training period that is designed to meet more complex training requirements. In order to build efficiency under this constrained training timeline, commanders will travel to installations that have all the small arm ranges to meet their training requirements. Units training at Camp Edwards either have to split their units up to meet their training requirements or sacrifice all crew serve readiness in order to meet other job-specific training or administrative requirements. Units that decide to travel to other installations lose valuable training time to transit and sacrifice job-specific proficiency training to meet qualification readiness requirements. The multipurpose machine gun range was developed, proposed, and selected to provide all soldiers the ability to meet these training requirements in one place and ensure commanders have the resources necessary to complete the tasks that they are mandated to execute. This project is split into 2 phases. Phase 1, which again is the image to the right, is the project that is currently funded, which is 8 lanes at 800 meters. Phase 2, which is currently unfunded and not currently being requested for approval by the Environmental Management Commission, is to extend 2 lanes to 1,500 meters to support the M2 50 caliber machine gun. The proposed range location is sited on the known distance range, which does not meet current Army training requirements. The M249 and 240 Bravo and its supporting copper ammunition have already been approved for use at India Range, which is a 25-meter zero range. This active range supports larger qualification ranges. As presented in Colonel Porter's summary, India Range is one of the 6 ranges that have been brought online through MEPA, NEPA, and EMC processes from 2007 to 2017. For this slide, the footprint for the multi-purpose machine gun range will require 10 acres of clearing for fire breaks and 98 acres of clearing to support the range floor. We'll be using 30 acres of the existing known distance range to support this project. Katy range footprint was one of the factors that determined the proposed location of this range. The milestones listed on this slide only include the formal actions conducted by the Massachusetts National Guard in preparation for this project. Due to the nature of the regulatory environment and the constant communication, our staff has, with our state and federal agency partners, had many updates and consults before the formal process started. The conservation management permit started in January of 2018 with the initiation of our formal discussion with the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program and completed with the receipt of the final permit in September of 2020. The state MEPA process was started with a notice of project change of the Massachusetts Military Reservation Final Area-Wide Environmental Impact Report. This NPC was distributed to all 85 stakeholders listed in the original report, which was completed in 2001, which includes state and federal regulatory authorities, surrounding towns, local tribes, and the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce, Cape Cod Conservation District, and the Association to Preserve Cape Cod. Through stakeholder input, we filed a single environmental impact report and distributed it to the same 85 stakeholders. On July 17, 2020, we received the signed SEIR certificate, which includes letters from the Environmental Management Commission, Department of Environmental Protection, Divisions of Fisheries and Wildlife, and the Cape Cod Commission that support that the project adequately and properly complies with MEPA and its implementing regulations. In 2018, AECOM was contracted to assist in the preparation and distribution of an environmental assessment in order to meet NEPA. The environmental assessment is a 111-page document with an additional 5 annexes that explore the individual and cumulative potential environmental, cultural, and socioeconomic effects of the proposed action. Upon completion of the EA in August of 2019, interagency letters were sent to federal, state, and local stakeholders. Examples of these letters and the full responses we received can be found in Appendix A of the environmental assessment. Once our stakeholder input was incorporated into the EA, the Massachusetts National Guard opened the public comment period from 8 August through 7 September 2020. Through the course of this period, the Massachusetts National Guard received 367 letters consisting of 916 comments. Each comment has been cross-referenced against the environmental assessment to ensure that all concerns were properly addressed in the document. This review process was conducted by National Guard Bureau, the outside federal review entity for the document, to ensure that our answers were proper and sufficient. Additionally, as a courtesy, the Department of the Army conducted an additional review. At the end of this process, no significant adverse impacts were identified, and it was determined that no additional analysis was needed. The response summary document can be found on the Environmental and Readiness Center website. The completion of the FONSI is a culmination of thousands of man-hours and careful analysis of any potential impacts, careful review of and response to public comments, and the ongoing commitment of the Massachusetts National Guard to ensure that any project concerning the Upper Cape Water Supply Reserve ends in a net benefit to the habitat and water supply that we are charged to protect. From 2012 to now, we have been providing regular updates to the Environmental Management Commission and its advisory bodies on the award and progress in the development of the multipurpose machine gun range. Our most detailed brief to the EMC occurred in 2018, where we held detailed briefings on the range and its purpose. On June 3rd, 2021, the Science Advisory Council met and voted that the multipurpose machine gun project complies with environmental performance standards. In 2015, at the recommendation of the EMC, we contacted the Army Public Health Center to conduct a live fire noise study to validate the computer modeling required by both regulation and the environmental performance standards. This live fire test was conducted in partnership with the Environmental Management Commission and included the use of the M249, M240 Bravo, the M2 50 caliber sniper rifle. In order to get the best data possible, all adjacent ranges were active during this test fire. Prior to the test, we sent out 700 flyers to the surrounding neighborhood, which is indicated in the blue on this image, and we solicited feedback. We received 7 response letters to that outreach. This test fire validated the computer modeling, and its findings were incorporated into the design. Through this additional analysis, a decision was made to move the firing line 100 meters further north on Katy Range to maximize noise mitigation. As part of our commitment to continuous monitoring, we have agreed to conduct another noise analysis after the construction of the range to measure impacts and determine if additional mitigation is required. At this time, I'd like to hand it off to Mr. Jake McCumber, our Natural Resources Manager.
Good evening, everybody. As Major McDonough said, my name is Jake McCumber. I manage the Natural Resources and Training Lands program for the Massachusetts Army National Guard. And I'd also like to mention that 2 members of my team are actually residents of Falmouth, including myself. We value being a part of this community, and I'm proud to be here with you tonight. So the Army and all of Department of Defense have significant conservation requirements. This includes federally mandated natural resources programs, partnerships with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and state wildlife agencies, and management plans that are specifically overseen by those agencies. We work very closely with Mass Wildlife and many others for long-term conservation planning, extensive surveys for plants and animals, and active habitat restoration and management. I have a team of 6 full-time conservation specialists focused on Camp Edwards, managing for the highest quality habitat and the healthiest ecosystem. This is all possible because of the Army training mission and the funding that provides for us to manage for long-term sustainability of the training site. We have a strong reputation in the conservation community, as does Camp Edwards is a true conservation success. The multipurpose machine gun range actually presented us with a major conservation opportunity. The mitigation plan developed with and approved by Mass Wildlife established a funding requirement from the federal government that nearly doubled our annual project budget for both wildlife monitoring and habitat restoration. It is setting the stage for us to manage areas we weren't even previously able to access. Mass Wildlife affirmed that our plan provides a net benefit, which means overall positive outcomes for a whole suite of state-listed species in their habitat. The habitat component is a key focus as the Upper Cape Water Supply Reserve specifically protects habitat. Our site-wide management efforts and active conservation ensure that ranges function as wildlife habitat and that construction of ranges does not present a significant threat or loss. Our range mitigation plan took a site-wide approach, established a novel mitigation bank structure that allows us to restore habitat early and effectively, and it combines 4 types of mitigation for maximum benefit and effect. We've transferred 410 acres to Mass Wildlife to expand the Crane Wildlife Management Area. We've established closed canopy forest reserves in the northern and western portions of the base, and we've established large pine barren zones to focus our mitigation efforts on restoration of the diverse barrens, woodlands, and shrublands. Between box turtle forest protection at a 1.5 to 1 ratio and pine barrens at a 4 to 1 ratio, we're actually doing 5.5 acres of mitigation within the reserve for every acre of disturbance. Finally, we're significantly expanding on our already intensive plant and animal monitoring to track results and collaborate with Mass Wildlife through annual reports and meetings. It is an impressive plan that we've invested heavily in and built off our strong foundation of conservation at Camp Edwards and our valued partnerships with other agencies. The key to long-term conservation planning is knowing what we have and the needs of that ecosystem and its species. We've done extensive research and monitoring over the last several decades and partnered with numerous agencies and conservation organizations to share knowledge, collaboratively plan for conservation in southeastern Massachusetts, and actively manage for those outcomes. For example, we've been doing annual bird surveys at Camp Edwards since 1994, and we found 179 species of birds on base. Just a few other stats include that we've documented 144 species of bees, 485 species of moths, 45 species of butterflies, and over 550 plant species. We have 41 state-listed species of plants and animals that we track and manage, many of which have had detailed research projects. All of this is within what we call a pine barrens ecosystem, which is a globally important community mainly in New Jersey, Long Island, and southeastern Massachusetts. The military training integrates very effectively with this system because pine barrens are disturbance dependent. They need fire and forestry to be healthy, to support the species that live here, and to be resilient to climate change and other impacts. To this end, we average 300 acres per year of prescribed fire and 90 acres of other forest management planned and often implemented with our partner agencies. Our conservation successes are possible because of the strong support and requirement for Army conservation to support the training mission. We are highly dedicated to the conservation of this valuable site, and our outcomes have and continue to play a major role in regional conservation efforts, including recovery of the New England cottontail rabbit and several other species. We know of and manage for species at Camp Edwards that have few or no other populations in the northeastern U.S., such as the Walsh's digger bee and the Agassiz's clam shrimp. Camp Edwards is a stronghold for many rare species for New England, such as the eastern whippoorwill and the grasshopper sparrow. And most species of conservation concern are documented with stable or increasing populations at Camp Edwards, despite declines throughout the northeastern U.S. This unique ecological value is truly because of the history of training at the base and our active conservation efforts as an agency. This all gives us the foundation to understand how to design, construct, and manage sustainable ranges within and as part of the wildlife habitat on the base, integrating quality soldier training with a healthy pine barrens ecosystem. Similar to wildlife habitat and rare species, detailed analysis was conducted for greenhouse gases as part of the environmental planning and review. The site-wide positive conservation management and habitat protection is important context along with multiple best management practices built into our project design. The greenhouse gas analysis was included as required in the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act documentation and thoroughly reviewed and approved as part of that process. Climate change and climate resilience have been high priority for the Department of Defense globally, nationally, and at the site level. Resilience and sequestration at multiple scales are critical to the DoD mission and training site sustainability. I was even a stakeholder on the Cape Cod Commission's Climate Action Plan, which is an excellent document if anybody hasn't seen it. It's on their website. I can't emphasize enough the importance of people also considering regional scale climate resilience in our Pine Barrens when discussing climate change, or the value we provide as a large block of healthy and protected Barrens habitat made possible by the training mission. We have partnered with numerous agencies and conservation organizations to share knowledge, collaboratively plan for conservation in southeastern Massachusetts, and actively manage for those outcomes. Partnerships are critical to regional conservation planning and implementation. We play a very active role in many formal and informal partnerships for conservation success on the base, throughout the region, and nationally. This is also key to our constant learning and adaptive management with a broad partner base of specialists and conservation professionals. So thank you, and I'll hand it over to Mr. Ben Gregson.
Good evening. My name is Ben Gregson. I'm the Remediation Manager for the Impact Area Groundwater Study Program. I work for the Mass Army National Guard on that program. Our program has been focused on investigation and cleanup of the groundwater. It really started back in 1997 when the EPA issued an administrative order requiring that the Army and National Guard investigate and clean up any contamination found in the northern 15,000 acres Camp Edwards portion of what was then Mass Military Reservation and what is now Joint Cape Cod. I joined the program in 1999 and have been working on the project ever since. Just to orient you on the figure on the screen, this shows northern part of the base, and what's indicated here are the plumes of contamination that we found and are currently cleaning up. We have two contaminants of concern in our program in the groundwater. The first is explosive RDX, and the next is a propellant or oxidizer called chlorate. We have not found any groundwater contamination from what you typically associate with small arms range firing. We don't have any plumes of lead, copper, antimony, or any of the propellants in small arms ranges, small arms ammunition. The range that we're speaking about is in the, can be seen. You may be able to see this pointer, but the KD range, the proposed location of the MPMG range, is located here in the south central part of the figure. I wanted to point out that we have not identified any groundwater contamination currently underneath the proposed location of the MPMG range. To the east, we have what's called the J ranges, which were defense contractor ranges, and we have contamination there with RDX and chlorate that's currently undergoing treatment. And over to the left, to the west of that, we have our demolition area 1 plume with the source area right here, migrating to the west towards Bourne. We've been working closely with EPA and Mass DEP throughout the project. They currently have 5 professionals dedicated to our project, and they've been working with us on pretty much a daily basis since we began in 1997. So they've been heavily involved with our program. So what have we found? This figure here is again another map showing our RDX and perchlorate groundwater plumes, and it also shows some of the treatment systems we have in place. Many of them have been constructed in shipping containers to reuse those structures, and we have some buildings we built, and we share a location with the Air Force cleanup program at one of our sites. We currently have 14 sites on the base for our program. We have 12 groundwater plumes of RDX and chlorate. We have a total of 17 treatment systems that have been constructed for 7 of the plumes. The other 5 plumes had concentrations of contaminants low enough where monitored natural attenuation was chosen as the remedy. To date, we've treated 16 billion gallons of water. That water, once it's treated, gets re-injected as clean water back into the aquifer. Our current rate of treatment is 4 million gallons. As part of our program, we have really looked at everything, including impacts from small arms ranges. That work began in 1998. We've collected over 1,000 soil samples from 40 current and former small arms ranges that comprise a total of almost 1,400 acres. Many of these ranges dated back to World War II and have not been used in years. We went through a records check, found all the ranges, and conducted investigations at those ranges. As a result of the soil sampling that we conducted at the ranges, we did find soil contaminated primarily with lead that required removal. Soil excavation was conducted at 12 small arms ranges. Soils were removed to meet the updated state standard of 200 milligrams per kilogram for lead. The reason we removed the soil was to eliminate a threat of direct contact with soil. Again, we saw no evidence that we had leaching of lead to the groundwater at any of these ranges. But in removing the lead from the soil to this cleanup standard, it allows for unrestricted use of these areas in the future. We removed a total of about 24,000 cubic yards of soil from these ranges and recovered and recycled 71 tons of lead. Our program also included a groundwater investigation. 54 monitoring wells were chosen to be sampled to evaluate groundwater beneath the ranges. Results of the groundwater investigations showed that lead, copper, antimony were all below action levels, mostly at or near background level. As Colonel Porter mentioned in his introduction in the EPA decision document in 2015, they indicated that the overall results of the groundwater evaluations conducted to date indicate that the small arms ranges are not currently a source of any significant groundwater contamination. That, hand it off.
So just in conclusion, just to kind of wrap this up a little bit before we turn it over, just a quick statement and a couple points. This project is consistent with our agency's mission, has been built into our long-term planning for well over 20 years, which has allowed us to plan and implement site-wide management monitoring and reporting to ensure the project is not a significant impact. This is a responsibly planned range incorporating input from our local, state, federal agencies and stakeholders. Copper ammunition from small arms range activity does not contaminate groundwater. Machine gun fire has been conducted in this relative location of the proposed range since 2007 without incident. This machine gun range is a critical readiness requirement of the Army, National Guard. And the conservation and management plan was developed in concert with Mass Wildlife and provides for a net benefit for wildlife habitat and endangered species. And really, just to kind of, really wrap it up, I know there is a history of contamination, on the base as a whole. And we've worked hard over the past 20 years, 20 plus years to really to improve that and really get to what Ben had talked about is clean up that groundwater, the soils around it. The soldiers the teams that work on this project and all the, work on the base on a regular basis, we have taken that, and really that embrace that culture of training as well as the culture of conservation and combined it, and we really have. So I know it's, there's a lot of, history there, and a lot of you are around here. We're here and part of that community working group and well before that, and I understand that, and we definitely empathize. But we know this is a good project, and we hope that you can see that as well. Thank you. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Alex, if you want to.
So one last thing, as a lot of people already know, we're offering public tours of the Camp Edwards training area, and we're offering them every Friday except for next Friday. The point of contact email is on this last slide. We've done 3 tours so far, and it's been an overwhelmingly positive response. It's one thing to see slides and pictures of the site, but it's another thing entirely to actually walk the ground, see the treatment systems, and have a more one-on-one conversation with all of us. The size of the tours is limited to 24 folks, so we can encourage a dialogue between us as we're going through these tours, and it's quite a drive, so there's a lot of time on the bus to ask questions of both myself and Jake, and then Ben participates in those too. So definitely encourage folks to email Emily with interest. The slots are filling up fast, and at the end of September, we'll be assessing what the level of interest is and looking at different times to possibly offer this tour at, because we understand that 9 in the morning to noon doesn't work for everyone, and we want to try to show people what is going on the base. Second piece of information, all this information that has been presented to you can be found on the Environmental and Readiness Center website. In addition to that, every year for Chapter 47 of the Acts of 2002, we publish a State of the Reservation report. That document talks about everything that the base does for training. So if you really want to know what we do for training in terms of how many soldiers we train, how many rounds we fire, it's all in that document. And that is a requirement. It's publicly available. And a lot of the comments, people don't know that this site exists. This site is for everyone in the community to reference, and it's open to the public at all times. So I highly encourage you everyone here to look at the site. And an easy way to find it, because it's hard to read a URL sometimes, go to Google. I think everyone knows how to do Google, and type Environmental and Readiness Center, and it's always the first result on Google. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. So if that concludes your presentation, we'll move to the next group with Rosemary Carey and her friends.
Are they coming up here? Do you want us to stay here, or are they taking these seats?
Yeah, okay.
Where's Ella? Yeah, I'm trying. Yeah, there you go. Oh. Okay. Hope that doesn't count against my time. Thank you for your patience. Thank you, Chairman Brown and members of the Falmouth Select Board. My name is Rosemary Dreger Carey, and I live in North Falmouth. Before I begin, I would like to say to Colonel Porter and his team, thank you for being here tonight, especially on this very difficult night, and we share your grief over the loss of service members and Afghan citizens today. I'm an organizer with 350 Cape Cod, the local chapter of the Global Climate Group, 350.org, a board member at the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative, and a leader in the large and growing Cape-wide coalition to oppose the gun range. With me tonight are Mon Cochran, Vice President of the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative, and Ella Sampu, also a board member of the collaborative. We appreciate the opportunity to present tonight. Since it was first introduced to the public 1 year ago, this project has drawn widespread, sustained, vocal opposition from residents up and down the Cape. Our coalition represents those local, diverse voices and includes the major environmental groups on the Cape, as well as faith and civic groups. We are not anti-military. In fact, many of our most vocal members, including my colleague Mon, are veterans, and some are Gold Star families. We have no agenda other than to stop the further degradation of Cape Cod's fragile water supply, protect our forested land, preserve our climate, and preserve the quality of life and our livelihoods on Cape Cod. We believe this project is wrong for the Cape and call for an immediate suspension of it until an independent EIS is completed. I got this picture from the Joint Base Cape Cod website, and I thought it deserved our attention tonight so that we could understand the massive scale of the base compared to Cape Cod and let that sink in. The land area of the base represents 10% of Cape Cod's landmass, and as the base points out on its website, this is the largest piece of protected, undeveloped land on Cape Cod. It's also one of the last remaining globally important pine barrens on the East Coast, a rare and endangered ecosystem. The climate protection plan that Mr. McDonough mentioned earlier of the Cape Cod Commission specifically recommends against intruding on the last globally important undisturbed land. The Upper Cape would also sit atop the Upper Cape, the gun range would also sit atop the Upper Cape water supply. The towns of Sandwich, Mashpee, Falmouth, Bourne, Barnstable, and Yarmouth get up to 3 million gallons of clean drinking water daily. The source is the Sagamore Lens, one of 6 sole source aquifers connecting all the water on the Cape. Touched upon by Colonel Porter, not entirely missing from the conversation, which I'm very glad, but the base has a long legacy of pollution. In 1989, it was designated as a Superfund site, costing taxpayers more than $1.4 billion, and it's still not cleaned up. The current proposal is for a range of 8 lanes. The current proposal is for a range of 8 lanes up to 800 meters each, that's just under half a mile, and mentions 2 additional ranges up to 1,500 meters each, almost a mile. The health and environmental impacts of these additional lanes have not been studied, though the plan makes it clear these additional lanes are coming. Our coalition questions how this massive project got so far along without the public knowing about it. In 1997, then Governor Cellucci vetoed a similar proposal on the grounds that it was incompatible with watershed protection. That same year, Mass Military Reservation, MMR, master plan designated the area as permanently protected. In 2002, the Upper Cape water supply was established by Chapter 47 of the Acts of 2002. I'll discuss this in a minute. Then in 2012, the project was approved by the Pentagon. That was 9 years ago. And in 2015, the project was appropriated $11 million by Congress. So Cape Codders first learned about this project almost a decade after it was approved to go forward. In 2020, we were told in a tiny ad in the Cape Cod Times of the existence of this project and that an environmental assessment had been completed and there would be no significant impact and no significant controversy. But the public response proved otherwise. Despite the failure of the base to conduct effective community outreach for 9 years, 367 members of this community during the height of the pandemic submitted 916 comments to the EMC. The comments came from laypeople, scientists, veterans, physicians, and youth, year-round and part-time residents, and visitors who love the Cape. The vast majority of comments were opposing. Our top concerns: the health impacts due to the potential contamination from metals and groundwater leaching into the soil and groundwater. Climate impacts due to the loss of trees and their carbon sequestration value in the near term when we need it, and increased greenhouse gas emissions from an 18% increase in base activities. Loss of habitat protection, disturbance and encroachment, and loss of listed species are also our concerns, as well as socioeconomic impacts due to increased noise, traffic, and decreased desirability of neighboring towns as a residential community and a tourist destination. Finally, we question whether this massive gun range is necessary at all and whether alternatives were fully explored. The environmental assessment tells us that there are no local alternatives, but Fort Devens in Massachusetts is less economically sensitive, and this was not considered. Specifically, our concerns regarding water include the risk of explosive-related compounds leaching into the soil as shell casings and their toxic contents degrade and find their way into our water supply. Copper bullets. A career marine biologist from this community submitted a report to this select board that cautioned copper bullets are not a harmless green solution that they are cracked up to be. Degraded copper can indeed make its way to soil and then to our ponds and streams, harming fish and marine animals. Even members of the Science Advisory Council in their meeting in June said that, expressed that copper bullets used at the base have not been studied. We're also concerned about the removal of hazardous and toxic waste being handled, stored, and transported through our community. Concerns also about the application of herbicides and pesticides to the 5,000 acres of maintained grasslands, fuel spills during construction, and now there's evidence that PFAS, aka forever chemicals, have been found in Mashpee's water supply due to past U.S. Air Force activities, but the $8 million cost to clean it up will not be borne by the military, but by its Mashpee neighbors. These are very serious issues. We are encouraged that the US EPA announced this week that they will conduct a study on the water impacts. But that may not be enough. A comprehensive, independent EIS and a legal review are necessary too. Protection of our water supply is guaranteed under the law. The Upper Cape Water Supply Reserve was established in the Acts of 2002, Chapter 47, by the Commonwealth to serve three purposes: water and habitat protection, development of public water supply infrastructure, and use of the military forces of the Commonwealth, provided that such military use and training is compatible with the two previous purposes. According to the EMC's Science Advisory Council, The environmental performance standards used to make their decision in the recent meeting in June do not meet 21st century environmental standards. Furthermore, the use of the range by out-of-state soldiers and non-military personnel violates the law. Under Chapter 47, only suitable use by military forces of the Commonwealth is allowed. Despite the JBC's assurances of impeccable environmental stewardship, we have learned from experience that accidents do happen, discovery of the risks and resolutions can take years, if not decades. Water pollution has serious health impacts, and full remediation is not assured. Our drinking water supply deserves full protection from all of the risks that the gun range will introduce, not engineering solutions and adaptive management practices. Full protection, no new risks. Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Mon Cochran.
Thank you, Rosemary. It's a little tight up here. I am Mon Cochran. I'm a native Cape Codder living in Orleans, and I'm wearing 3 hats this evening. First, I'm a U.S. Marine Corps veteran with 13 months of combat experience in Vietnam. Second, I'm a retired Cornell professor of early child development. And third, I'm vice president of the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative. The mission of the collaborative is to reduce the carbon footprint on Cape Cod and the islands. I have read over the environmental assessment of firing range impacts conducted by the Army, and I find that the assessment seriously underestimates climate-related and other impacts of this plan. I'll start by focusing on the 170 acres of clear cutting and then discuss the impacts on hundreds of animal, bird, and insect species, and finish by talking about the noise impacts on young children and others. The Army analysis of the carbon-reducing impacts of clear cutting 170 forest acres is grossly inadequate in my view. 2 types of loss will result from clear cutting. First, the trees will release a major carbon load when they're removed. The Army acknowledges that this will happen, but doesn't fully play out the impact. Using estimates provided me by scientists at your own Woodwell Center for Climate Change, right down the road in Woods Hole, I calculate that this one-time CO2 release from the clear cutting will be equivalent to burning more than 1.5 million gallons of gasoline. Second, the overall environmental damage will be far worse than that initial release. If these trees were allowed to remain, they would absorb the emissions of about 200 cars a year for at least 20 years. Put another way, the emissions caused by burning over 300,000 additional gallons of gasoline a year for 20 years would be absorbed by the 170 acres of forest if those trees were allowed to remain. The Army fails to lay out this long-term impact. It claims that somehow surrounding forest will take up the slack. That is highly unlikely in my view. Please bring in experts from your Woodwell Center for Climate Change to find out. The total CO2 impact of the proposed clear cutting is the combination of these 2 events, the carbon release at the time of removal and the 20 years of absorption loss due to the missing trees. Added together, the proposed forest removal will add to our atmosphere the amount of CO2 produced by burning more than 2 million gallons of gasoline. The Army claims that the loss of forest carbon sequestration will be less impactful than the emissions produced by trucks transporting soldiers to Vermont and back for machine gun training, which is an alternative. First, I challenge their calculations. Second, in 5 years, the Army had better be transporting soldiers in electric buses, fueled with electricity generated off the Massachusetts coast, which will be carbon-free, of course. The Joint Base has a Science Advisory Council. I listened to their deliberations on this project back in June. The scientists on that council stated very clearly that quote, the measurement of the climate impacts of this plan used by the environmental assessment were not up to 21st century standards. I couldn't agree more. A full environmental impact analysis needs to be conducted on this project by a disinterested party. Another huge impact of the planned project will be on the various creatures living in the area to be clear-cut. Remember, in 2002, Massachusetts established this land as the Upper Cape Water Supply Reserve for water supply and habitat protection to be used to train military forces of the Commonwealth, provided that use is compatible with the natural resource purposes of water supply and wildlife habitat protection. There are, if you want to add up the numbers on the screen, 973 species that have been identified in the reserve by the Army. The Army is asking us to believe that they will be protected or relocated through this plan, and that there will ultimately be a net benefit to them. We simply don't believe that machine gunning and species protection are compatible. We recommend that experts from the Sierra Club or the Massachusetts Audubon Society be brought in to testify on this matter. As Susan Starkey, co-director of the Cape and Islands Faith Communities Environmental Network, has stated, you can't protect animals when you're shooting machine guns. A colleague of mine at Cornell, Professor Gary Evans, researches the impacts of noise pollution on children. He and colleagues have found that chronic exposure to noise is associated with modest elevations of resting blood pressure, attentional deficiencies, and deficits in reading. Other suspected effects include diminished task motivation, deficits in auditory discrimination, poorer memory with high information processing demands, and deficits in infant cognitive development. Forestdale Elementary School would be about a mile from the proposed machine gun range, if I understand correctly. As an expert in early child development who specialized in early education, I would not recommend to a parent that she or he send their child to that school if machine gunning could be heard there. Economic impacts. As this table shows, the quality of schools has the biggest impact on home values in a neighborhood. Proximity to a shooting range is among the top 10 factors lowering home values. If Forestdale School is perceived as lower quality because of machine gun noise pollution, then real estate in that neighborhood will drop in value. Noise pollution doesn't just affect children in schools. We're particularly concerned about the residents of the Barnstable County Correctional Facility located on base grounds. Finally, a few words from a combat veteran. I returned from Vietnam with a significant amount of post-traumatic stress syndrome. For 10 years, a panic response would be triggered by something as common as the sound of a helicopter. I could not live within the sound of a firing range of any kind, and I am guessing that there are other veterans on the Cape who feel the same way. The impacts of a firing range on our drinking water reserve would be felt far into the future. For that reason, we need to hear the voices of our younger residents who will have to live with these consequences. I'm pleased to turn the rest of our presentation over to Ella Sampro. Ella?
Thank you, Mon, for the introduction. My name is Ella Sampu. I grew up in West Barnstable, and I'm currently a renter in South Yarmouth. I'm an activist, I'm a community organizer, and I have a background in conservation public policy. 2 weeks ago, on the banks of Scorton Creek in Sandwich, I found myself comparing abdominal scars with a fellow beachgoer, a woman almost twice my age who had also grown up in Barnstable County. Both of us have had large growths removed from our ovaries, and the woman confided in me that she had always suspected the source of her reproductive disease was in part due to the groundwater and the contamination from the base. The growth inside of me totaled 9 centimeters by this June, and surgery took place 2 days after I first spoke publicly about my opposition to the machine gun range at a rally at Forestdale Elementary. I'm sharing this anecdote not because I want to make the claim that there is a direct link between the Superfund site located above the aquifer I drink from and my endometrioma, because indeed that claim would be quite hard to prove, but because I want to illustrate how seriously fear and suspicion of activity on the base has permeated our community consciousness. We've heard plenty of reasons tonight about why a more serious environmental review of the proposed range is necessary, why we would like the Massachusetts Army National Guard to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this project would do no harm, and I would like to add one more. The fear and concern around the unknown and certainly unintended effects of Joint Base Cape Cod activity run deep across multiple generations in our community. Our concerns are informed by facts about our increasingly fragile environment and our knowledge of past damage to public health and the natural world caused by activity on the base. Distrust, then, seems like a sensible response when we are told that the project will have no significant impact. The solution here is clear. The Environmental Management Commission can put this project on hold, and they can require that it be subject to a full environmental impact statement. And our elected officials, both the selectmen in this room and Governor Baker, can add their voices to ours in asking for proof that the proposed machine gun range will do no harm. I'm here tonight because I've read the environmental assessment, and as a younger person, I face down a future on an ever-warming planet, a future on a peninsula made out of sand that's full of people and plants and animals whose way of life is facing increasing pressure from the development and degradation of our environment. And I want to be able to look back on this moment, maybe 25 years from now, and say that our leaders and those charged with protecting our nation made the right decision. Introducing new risk to our water, ecosystem, and climate is entirely avoidable. As our leaders consider how to move forward, I ask that they use the precautionary principle, which is, if a product, an action, or a policy has a suspected risk of causing harm to the public or the environment, protective action should be supported even though there may not be full scientific proof of risk. We do not yet have a complete scientific assessment, and until we do, We believe it's better to be safe than sorry. Public opposition is growing. 2,260 people from across the state have signed our Change.org petition opposing the range. Letters to the editor, op-eds, letters to select boards, comments to the Environmental Management Commission have overwhelmingly been in opposition. Around 200 people attended a recent rally in Sandwich, and despite the risk of COVID, folks are here tonight to show their opposition. Last April, Senators Warren and Markey and Congressman Keating sent a letter to the director of the Army National Guard requesting that the Army determine whether a full environmental impact statement is warranted and that abutters to those who rely on the Cape's sole source aquifer be considered. This request was summarily rejected by the Pentagon. Last week, our federal delegation applauded the EPA's decision to conduct a water quality study under the Water Act. On June 25th, State Senator Susan Moran has described the outreach done by the base during her tenure as chair of the Falmouth Select Board as, quote, like knocking on a window with a wet sponge. She has called for an immediate suspension of any further action. Finally, on July 23rd, Governor Baker signaled that he found the study and public outreach lacking. There are alternatives to this machine gun range. Soldiers are able to train with simulators. We already have one on the base, and can complete their Army requirement basic live fire weapons training elsewhere at ranges already in existence, such as in neighboring Vermont. Additionally, a machine gun range is being optioned in Devens, Massachusetts, and is on track to be completed around the same time as the range we are discussing today, should it be approved. Our aquifer is fragile. It's already polluted from base activity and faces increasing pressure from inadequate wastewater management. Our largest tract of undisturbed land on Cape Cod is home to globally rare pine barren forests and countless creatures whose ears are often more sensitive than our own. Our service-based economy is dependent on tourists and second homeowners who are drawn to the Cape's natural beauty. Communities who surround the base are full of vulnerable populations like school children, veterans, the working class, communities of color, the incarcerated, and our Mashpee-Wampanoag tribe. They are the rightful stewards of this land. There's also our atmosphere, whose carbon content has been pushed past its breaking point, according to the latest IPCC report. This is why a large and growing coalition of Cape Cod organizations are urging that this project be stopped or at least studied further. Our coalition believes this unnecessary project should never have been sited here, that it is so far proceeded without a comprehensive independent study of its impacts, and that it has lacked transparency and community outreach. We ask this board to take a position against the range and to write a letter to the state-appointed Environmental Commission and Governor Baker calling for an immediate suspension and an environmental impact statement. I'd like to thank our audience for taking time to be with us this evening, to the Falmouth Select Board for hosting us, and also to the Joint Base for interfacing with us. It's absolutely a luxury to finally be hearing from you. If you'd like to know how you can get involved or what steps you can do to voice your opposition to this project, we encourage you to reach out to us at 350cape@gmail.com or contact Mon and I directly. Thank you.
And if we could have the Joint Base Cape Cod guys come back up to the stage, because we want to have a chance for them to comment on any of the statements made that may be inaccurate in their view. And then we're going to have questions and answers.
Okay, thank you for that presentation, and thank you for the opportunity just to make a couple minor corrections on a few things. And then I think it's important for us to get to some questions from the public, which is really the reason why we're here. Just one thing, I brought this up at the sandwich meeting as well, just doing some research, and it was, 1997, acting Governor Salucci at the time had in the, made a comment that he would remove from consideration 5 range projects, or I think they're all range projects actually, for the Army from the community working group. That was the statement, and it was in the Boston Globe. It wasn't legislation. It wasn't an executive order. The term veto would make you believe that it was some sort of legislation. It wasn't. It was just the fact that because we did not completed the investigation of the impacts of lead and copper in the small arms ranges that are still being investigated by the EPA, it really wasn't proven at that point to move forward, and it would have bogged down the community working group, and that was the main purpose for it. So it's just a technicality, but it's important for context to know that it wasn't legislation. It wasn't anything filed. It was a comment. Jake, I know you have a couple comments, and I'll let you take over from here.
Yeah, one, I would like to say it was, nice to see some of the numbers from our own management planning up there. That's good to see people looking at our documents. I do just want to touch on a few of those points. One of which is, there's definitely a view out there that what we've been saying or what we've found in this process is just us saying it. But that's part of why we went through the regulatory timelines of what we did for this project. So those external reviews have been done by subject matter experts working for numerous agencies. Our project went through consultation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It went through years of permitting with Mass Wildlife regarding all of those species in the rare pine barrens. And all of you heard me talk about the value of that habitat and what we do for it on the base. We truly do value it and manage for that high quality. The reason it is so valuable is the history of use on that site, the history of fire and management on that site, and what we do. And so that site-wide context is quite important. And that external oversight, not just partnerships, but true regulatory oversight from those agencies is critical to understand to the determinations that were made in the permits we received for these projects. Now, as it relates to some of the early points, the massive scale of the base and some of those issues, that's one of our true benefits. And one of the big reasons why the Department of Defense, including Camp Edwards, but agencies in general, have so much land is so that we can manage for large-scale sustainable landscapes and habitats, because a key part of the DoD mission is to train soldiers, and training soldiers takes land. Sometimes that's forested land for dismounted maneuvers such as what we call land navigation or orienteering. But sometimes it's ranges, and ranges are critically important to training soldiers. That takes that amount of land, but we have the remainder of the training site that we're managing for that long-term sustainability, and that context is key. It's key for how we protect and manage for our rare species, the ecosystem at large, and when we're talking about carbon sequestration. So those numbers that were given as context for offsetting, that's real, that we're managing that. We're providing additional protection for that habitat through the conservation and management permit that we established, both for the habitat benefit and the carbon sequestration benefit. Now, as it relates to Woodwell Climate Research Center, I do coordinate with Woodwell. We've talked about this project quite a bit, actually. And those independent numbers, I can't speak to the gallons of gasoline, but I do know that the independent analysis and numbers that were provided by Woodwell, that were published in the Boston Globe and everything else, those actually estimated half the carbon emissions of what our greenhouse gas analysis did, which would indicate, instead of our analysis found that within 3.5 years, the surrounding forested lands that we manage for high quality habitat would offset the emissions within 3.5 years. Now that's looking at the short-term emissions, not the long-term emissions. But the long-term emissions, it's going to be native habitat, native grasses, which obviously sequester less carbon, but still sequester carbon and put it into the ground in dense root systems. And we will continue to be managing those habitats, again, both for the species and for the carbon sequestration. And we've been increasing our habitat restoration, which is also an improvement for the carbon sequestration, the health of the forest, and importantly, the climate resilience to large-scale potential impacts such as southern pine beetle mortality, which is killing tens of thousands of acres of pitch pines in New York and New Jersey, where they've not been able to have the type of management we do, and is a major source of initial carbon emissions and a long-term loss of pine barrens habitat condition, but things like wildfire as well. So the climate resilience, again, is a key part of looking at those long-term impacts. You can't just look at those simplified numbers. You have to analyze the resilience of your landscape in a disturbance-dependent pine barrens.
Thanks, Jake. And just a couple minor pieces too. So again, we're here to discuss the multi-purpose machine gun range in this project. And I know your group was here to discuss your opposition to it. But the use of certain words and certain phrases that aren't related to the project, I don't think is really fair. Terms like explosive compounds. There are no explosive compounds with small arms ammunition that we're using. So the use of that is really antagonistic. I don't agree with that. That shouldn't be put in there. Another one is PFOS and PFOA. This range is not producing PFOS or PFOA. It's not a contributor to that contamination. So to put it into your program to talk about it when we're talking about a machine gun range, really all it does is incite fear, and that's not really what we're here to do. We're here to inform the public, and that's really what I think we got to stay focused on. So I just want to make sure that as we do this, words mean something, and how we say it means something. And when we say it, we're really trying to just get the communication across and really be forthcoming with what we're doing. And I think what Mr. McCumber was just saying about our habitat and the care that we've taken, and what the DoD does for conservation, I think is understated. We are probably the largest, conservation entity in the country, and I don't think people understand that. That's what we do. Like I said earlier, we really have embraced a culture of training and put it together with a culture of conservation. And I know it's hard to believe sometimes because we're wearing these green suits, and I know, the type of job that we do is difficult to understand that we actually really embrace conservation, but we do. It's part of our life. It's what our soldiers do. We train our soldiers to do it. Our whole team does it. And that's not just here on Camp Edwards. That's across DoD. So I think, I think that's really important to provide that context to you. And that's really what I have to say.
I think that emphasizes where we really truly hope people will come on the tours with us. I think that that's something that we've now seen has been lacking for people to actually see what the base looks like and what we do there, how successful it is, the quality of the training lands, the quality of the habitat. And one of them that's certainly challenging for people to understand is the conservation benefits that ranges can actually provide. It's really hard to understand if you don't have the sort of odd career specialty that I do of Army conservation. But it's something I'm passionate about because it is so truly effective. We have our own group called the National Military Fish and Wildlife Association because DoD conservation is specialized and extremely successful. And ranges are actually biodiversity hotspots. The ranges themselves provide habitat. The areas surrounding the ranges provide some of the most critical habitats for rare species throughout this country. Fort Indian Town Gap, in the surface danger zone of their multi-purpose machine gun range, which is what we're proposing, has the only known location of a subspecies of the regal fritillary butterfly, which is, now potentially getting federally listed because of its importance. But they are known as the premier managers for that species, and it's in the surface danger zone of that range because that range exists, because they burn it so much. And we see that at Camp Edwards, where when I take people to see some of our most special resources, I take them to the ranges. Whether it's the eastern whippoorwill, where we're doing migration studies with mass wildlife, at what we call India Range, I Range, which is very in the southern part of the base, but also at Sierra Range, where we go on the tour, which is some of the most prominent successful location for the slender clearwing moth, the frosted elfin butterfly, again, the eastern whippoorwill, and so many other species. And it's because the ranges are there. And some of it's because it's old ranges that now we manage with conservation techniques. So I know I've gone on too long about that, but it's because it's important. It's counterintuitive for people that aren't familiar with DoD training sites.
So gentlemen, if we could get to the questions now, I think the public is ready to go. So if people want to come down to the microphones with their questions and give a little space to the person ahead of you, and we'll take you one at a time. Please identify yourself when you speak.
Good evening. I'm Margaret Cooper. I live in Mashpee. I was a little surprised not to hear how you folks are planning to protect the water supply. All you've said is that so far it hasn't happened, and you haven't guaranteed that it will not happen. My question is, for what period of time can you guarantee that there will be no more drinking water contamination? Will it be until climate change decimates the Cape itself and we're no longer here? This plan to protect our drinking water has got to last, maybe not forever, but for 6, 8, 10 generations. That's a very long time. It has to be 100% perfect, or we'll have another contamination plume again. So, can you guarantee that over that period of time, there will be no equipment malfunction, no human error, no policy changes, no natural catastrophes, no freak accidents that would allow our drinking water to be contaminated again? Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. So it's difficult to answer a hypothetical, but our charge is to protect the aquifer, the water, and the habitat. And we don't introduce new contaminants into the aquifer or into the reserve. That's our charge. So everything we do goes through a rigorous review process to ensure that we do not introduce new contaminants that could contaminate the water. And that's what we do. We do it every single day.
If I could just add to that, one thing that I didn't mention, a lot of the work that I've done has been dealing with past contamination and learning the history of what's been done on the base and what some of the impacts are. But as part of bringing these ranges onto use, there's an operation and maintenance management plan in place for the ranges that includes soil sampling, groundwater sampling, and response plans to deal with any unforeseen circumstances that might come up that indicate that we were wrong in our prediction and this is a problem. So there is monitoring. You just don't have to take our word for it that off into the future that there won't be any problems, because the soil and groundwater is being monitored, and not just by us but by the environmental regulators as well.
The other item I'd just like to add to what Ben says, he must have read my mind, is these ranges are managed ranges, meaning that we have special design criteria that's built in partnership with the EMC to capture, contain, and recycle the rounds that we fire. This is a design element that is unique in the Army. No other installation does this. So we worked for years to do line of sights, test fires, and confirm that what we shoot into these capture berms, for the most part, captures the rounds that we fire. And when you layer on top of that what Ben just talked about soil monitoring and testing, we would know what is coming based on that testing. And that's not just testing done by, it's testing contracted by specialists, and then the results are analyzed by the EMC. So what Ben said is exactly right. You don't have to trust what the Army is saying. We have an environmental officer that is dedicated to our oversight, that looks at all of our results, all of our reporting, and all of our operations to make sure that the groundwater is being protected.
Hi, Adam Lang from Brewster. I represent United Cape Patriots. Thank you, Colonel and staff, for being here tonight. Thank you for your service. I know all of our thoughts are with the 12 brothers and sisters you lost today and all those in harm's way tonight in Afghanistan. And thank you, sir, for your service. Orleans, former Marine from Orleans. It was a really bad day for our country. We're here tonight to talk about expanding a gun range. There's a lot of hyperventilating by environmental extremists. We're not talking about putting a nuclear power plant in Cape Cod Bay. We're expanding a gun range on a military installation. Okay? What's the sacrifice from Cape Cod? These same environmental activists have no problem trucking their garbage over the Bourne Bridge every day down Route 495. Never heard a complaint. It gets buried in someone else's community. Okay? Where's the sacrifice from Cape Cod? A lot of our kids and our family members are serving now. They're sacrificing. We all need to sacrifice for our freedoms going forward. Okay? Your mission needs to remain defending freedoms, not fighting global warming. I don't know where we even got started down that path, okay? It's ludicrous, okay? I'm going to make a couple comments and then a question. I'll be brief. I heard the base has a long history of pollution. All right. Environmentalists have a long history of fear-mongering, okay, and scare tactics based on bad science, okay? They've never, ever been even close as far as their climate forecast, okay? So we need to step back from that a little bit. Talk about reducing the
Just over a minute left, sir. I just want to...
Okay, I'll hurry up. Reducing the carbon footprint on Cape and Islands. Even the state of Massachusetts admits the entire state only produces 1.7% of the nation's greenhouse gases. There is no industry left on Cape Cod. In fact, you could cut down every tree on Cape Cod and the temperature of the earth would never go up and the sea would never rise, all right? I know you don't want to hear from me, right? Right. Okay, my question. What are the next steps to seeing this range become a reality? I mean, what is the process with you and the Department of Defense with implementing this gun range? Thank you.
Okay, so the next steps, so we've completed the MEPA and the NEPA process. The next steps from a regulatory standpoint is really the Community Advisory Council advising the EMC and the EMC having gone through their vote, approving the design as well as the OMM, the operation, maintenance, and monitoring and reporting plan that we put forward. There's also, like we had discussed earlier, EPA full source aquifer review that's going to be it's ongoing right now, so it's already started. So that is going to kick off, and hopefully in the next month or two, that report should be out. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Sandy Feynman Silva, and I live in Falmouth. My well in West Falmouth in the mid-1980s was capped and closed, and town water had to be brought to my neighborhood because of the pollution at the base. That was in like 1986, 1987. This is not about NIMBYism. This is not about being pro or anti-military. This is about a spit of land that juts out into the Atlantic Ocean, upon which we live. This spit of land is unique. It contains aquifers, bodies of water underground that we rely on for our fresh drinking water. Ours, the Sagamore Lens, is directly below the 22,000-acre Joint Base Cape Cod, as you know. Between 1935 and the 1980s, this land was contaminated by base activity. Plumes of contamination were discovered that had already polluted the Sagamore Lens, our drinking water. Cleanup has cost $1.4 billion and counting, and it's still not finished, as you've already pointed out. In 1997, the Mass Military Reservation Master Plan declared that, and I quote, "The upper 15,000 acres should be permanently protected open land for water supply, wildlife habitat, open space, and compatible military uses." And steps were taken to protect this land. The master plan was memorialized into law in 2002 in Chapter 47 of the Massachusetts laws. Chapter 47 declared that Camp Edwards' 15,000 acres northern training area is the Upper Cape Water Supply Reserve, protected conservation land, and that military use and training must be compatible, and I'll repeat it, with the natural resources purposes of water supply and wildlife habitat protection. Earlier military uses of the Upper Cape had unanticipated consequences that nobody foresaw. Today we face future unanticipated consequences from this project, and we cannot take that chance yet again.
Sandy,
The Mass Army
less than a
National
minute
Guard
left there.
Okay. Personnel argue that their science is airtight, that they are the best scientific experts. We trusted them in the past to protect our interests. You failed us. We cannot let this happen again. The Science Advisory Council that monitors base activity admitted recently that the science used by the Army National Guard is out of date. The precautionary principle Ella mentioned says when an activity raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. We must abide by this principle and say no to this machine gun range. I urge the Select Board to say no, the Environmental Management Commission to say no, and I urge the public to say no to this ill-advised project. Thank you.
Ma'am, I realize there was no question in that statement, but Science Advisory Council never said that the Army science is out of date. That is not. Was that a direct quote that you have? That's the direct quote. That's not what they said, ma'am. Not what they said.
No, they said, and what they voted on was that the range that we have proposed is compliant with the environmental performance standards, but they wanted a review by the Environmental Management Commission of whether the environmental performance standards need modernized. In particular, they were concerned that there's no cap on future range development, but they certainly did not say that our science was out of date. And as far as compliance with Chapter 47, we would never design or propose a project that was not compatible military training with the groundwater reserve, because that is a huge waste of our time. And that is a critical resource for us. And so we work very closely with the environmental officer from the Environmental Management Commission and with the state regulatory and conservation agencies and the compliance agencies, so that when we put a project forward, we are certain, and everybody else is certain, that it will be compatible training with the natural resources priorities for the reserve.
Evening. My name is Andrew. I've lived on Cape Cod since 1983, the year I was born. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for being here. There's so much wrong with half the crap that was said since I got here that I almost don't even know where to start. Out of everybody in this room, would the people who are sworn to defend the lives of American citizens please raise your hand? Out of the environmentally conscientious people present, the number of them who are sworn to defend the lives of American citizens and this nation, please raise your hand. So, climate change is going to kill us all. This is science. One of the biggest activists and proponents for all the climate change horseshit that's been stated so far bought a mansion on Martha's Vineyard, right next to the water, where you can see the sea level rising and coming to kill us all. Sir, you're in charge of making sure that our soldiers, the men and women who are sworn to serve and protect us and defend this nation against all threats, foreign and domestic, most likely putting them in mortal danger to do so. How much of this EPA stuff will make sure that they stay safe and are able to do their jobs and protect us? How many of you, with all your environmental concerns,
Sir, if you could address your
have taken
questions
the time?
to the group up on the stage rather than the audience, please.
I find it more than a little disingenuous to be concerned about noise pollution with the amount of traffic produced by all the tourists who come to Cape Cod every damn day. I find it disingenuous that you're concerned about the causes of climate change when said proponent of environmental change with his mansion over on the island just had a whole bunch of his friends flown in on private jets, not electric, for a birthday party on the mansion on the beachfront where he can see the sea level rising and coming to kill us all. Out of everybody here, I find it interesting that nobody here is responsible for the upkeep, the maintenance, and the protection of more land than you gentlemen right here, or has to jump through more hoops than you gentlemen right here.
I appreciate your comments, sir, but we are at 3 minutes.
My grandfather served in World War II. He defended this nation.
Sorry, that's time, sir. We all have 3 minutes.
You don't need anybody here's permission to do what you folks need to do. I am an American citizen. I am a resident here all my life. You have my permission. You do what you need to do. Build the damn range.
All right.
Because
Thank you.
I trust you to be responsible for our environment more than these assholes. So you don't need anybody else's permission.
Time is up, please.
Come make me. Come make me. Come make me. You're full of shit, all of it.
This is out of control.
He's coming down.
It's coming.
Yeah, that's certainly out of line.
Resident. Sorry. I'm a Falmouth resident. I'm worried about climate change. The gun range proposal has been on course for over 20 years. And by 2030, which is less than 10 years away, we're supposed to be down by 50% use of carbon. And in 30 years, which is about the time range, we're going to be supposed to be down to zero net use of carbon. In the last 20 years, we've gone up in carbon, and the military is responsible for 20% of the carbon from the United States. So, I mean, we're looking at a small thing, but I think at a large scale, I think the military should really think of how they can contribute to decreasing their carbon levels by 50% within 10 years and by 100%.
I would just like to say that that is very important to the Department of Defense, and I think as an example, over the last 5 years or so, the only federal agency that was able to consistently continue explicitly addressing climate change was the Department of Defense, because of both the at-home and global potential impacts. And so the Department of Defense has been making very large strides in increasing sustainability of operations, and we're all required to have climate change planning in our management plans and everything else. So it's a high priority for Department of Defense, sir. Thank you.
Just to add a few points too, and I know sometimes it's hard to kind of wrap your hands around what the Department of Defense does in its entirety because it's a big organization. But just on the Cape, I'll give you some examples of some of the stuff that we're doing. And it's not just the Army, it's the Air Force, it's the active Air Force, it's the Coast Guard, but 85% of the paved pause energy is produced by the 2 turbines that they have. So that's a big carbon offset right there from one entity. That's almost, it's like I said, 85 to 90% is what they have stats that it offsets that energy. The barracks roofs on our 7 barracks will all be replaced, and then the next step is to replace windows, primarily to conserve energy. We are demolishing all of our World War II infrastructure in order to consolidate footprints for more modern facilities to conserve energy. Those are all things that we do on a regular basis. We do take it seriously. It's one of our main priorities. And I know you don't see it every day, and it's hard because the base doesn't provide access to everybody all the time. But that is a priority to us, and we continue to do it.
My name is Marilyn Komar. I grew up on the Cape, and my father was stationed at Otis Air Force Base, and in the 60s, and I used to fly over and tip his wings to say hello. And I used to feel very safe. I don't feel safe anymore. I am in support of the range because I think we should make it easy for our men to protect us however possible. I believe in your science. I would like to address the Cape Cod Commission and the 350 Club. I would like to know what Sue Moran thinks about taking down trees for this development that's going into Mashpee. We are paving Cape Cod. We are losing our water supply, not from the range. We have fertilizers going into our water. If they want to stop the development of Cape Cod, you talk about Mashpee and the Wampanoags. Why is this development going? What about the 170 trees? How many trees are coming down in Mashpee for this development at the Rotary? Develop Cape Cod. And I remember fields and trees and growing up climbing trees. We don't have it anymore. You need to worry about the fertilizers, the copper coming off the boats. Did you ever think about the copper coming off the boats, going into our water supply? That's copper that keeps boats free from algae. You're missing the boat, people, on the environment. Stop the pollution. Get the water under control. Stop the pollution in our water supply. Yes, there was problems back then, and there were problems all over the bases, all in the United States. That's what they did. That's what they did back then, and I know. But stop the fertilizer, get our waters under control, stop whatever it takes, septic, stop the development, and paving Cape Cod. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. And I really, I want to focus this on MPMG. I really, can't speak in great detail about the Mashpee Commons project. But what I can speak to is range projects and small arms ranges on the base. So historically, we've had about 1,000 to 1,400 acres worth of ranges on the base, small arms ranges. That's what was investigated by the EPA. We currently have 33. I know this is part of Major McDonough's presentation. So what's important to note there is when our training needs change, we don't just keep ranges open. We don't continue to deforest them. We allow them to go back to the original habitat. If you go out and look at the range complex, come on our tour and we'll show you what it looks like. It doesn't look like a wasteland desert that it did in the 60s and 70s and earlier than that. And I know Jake could even talk about, in early days, colonial days, there weren't many trees on Cape Cod. It's only through Army training and our protection of that training land that those trees have been allowed to go and return. They aren't being developed. We are protecting them as habitat. It's our conservation efforts that have allowed that habitat to return, and the conservation of that is extremely important to us.
My name is Patrick Vendetti. I grew up on Cape Cod. And this piece of letter that everybody got from town of Mashpee. I assume everybody got it, read it when they came in. And I read the whole thing. I had to read it like 2 or 3 times. And when I read it, it was nothing but opinion with no facts. Basically persuading on an unknown fact. Second of all, I keep hearing about the climate change and everything, and I see it from both sides. I can get it. But what I'm trying to figure out is how a firing range is going to produce more carbon emissions and climate change than all these windmills and everything else you're going to produce offshores. Now, I've driven a fuel truck for the last 10 years in town and been in the hazmat industry and cleaned up spills and everything else, and I know a lot about it. And I can tell you that doing offshore fueling and everything else and producing stuff offshore, you're basically altering the environment of the offshore, putting up wind turbines, altering the migration of birds, everything else. Now, when you do it on land, I just don't see the comparison as in climate change with a gun range. It just doesn't make any sense. I'm a common sense kind of guy. So I'm not understanding the whole, it's basically an attack on our U.S. military, is the way I see it. So.
Excuse me. We're going to have to ask you to speak to the microphone if you want to address the question.
That's pretty much all I have to say.
But you could.
And God bless the United States military. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
It's probably not on. No, it's not. It's for the TV at home. Yes. Sir. Okay. I thought he had a question, but. Okay, that's right. Thank you, Sam.
To the folks in the audience who are asking questions about other environmental concerns on Cape Cod, I would like to say that we hear you, that we are aware of these issues. We are aware of the fertilizer problem. We are aware that windmills come with risks as well. And we have our contact information up on the screen. Rather than directing these questions at the Joint Base, who they're not here to address those concerns. Again, I would like to point you to 350cape@gmail.com or myself. I'm not interested in hate mail, but I'm happy to engage with people about these other issues. Thank you.
My name's Tom Weaver. I live here on the Cape. I am a veteran. I appreciate what you do, but my question is, and it's actual question, what a change. Why can't you use simulation?
So first off, thank you for asking that question. And what I'll start with is, please come on the tour. Our first stop on the tour of the base is our simulation center. So there's a boring reason why we can't use just simulations, and there's the thing that's important to soldiers. The first reason is the Army National Guard, just like all Army entities, are bound to Army regulation. Army regulation states that soldiers are required to meet annual training requirements on live fire ranges, and it directs what type of ranges those are. So the multi-purpose machine gun range is in a manual, TC 25-8, that lays out what that range is supposed to look like, how the targets are going to be set up, and when soldiers qualify on that range, how they're supposed to qualify when the targets go up and what the final score is. So that's the boring answer. The more important answer to a soldier is simulations are used to save time and ammunition. But you have to go to a range to validate that your weapon works. Soldiers go to ranges with their assigned weapon, and then they qualify with it. Part of that maintenance requirement is that it's fired and maintained, and that soldier is building confidence that that weapon system will protect them. It is zeroed, meaning calibrated properly, so that when that soldier has to fire that weapon at unfriendly force, that he's going to hit what he's shooting at, or she. But those are the two reasons. There's Army regulations, and you have to ensure that what you're shooting at is what you're hitting with the assigned weapon by serial number that they have. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think you'd be very impressed with the simulations that we do use. We have very modern simulations for those ranges, and it's extremely important. And it allows us to put a lot of repetitions prior to going onto the range, which reduces the amount of ammunition that is fired, reduces the time, and reduces the cost of taxpayers.
Hi, my name is Mark Finner, and I'm from Falmouth. I'd like to start out with a question. What percentage of that 1.4 billion, or whatever it actually is, that's been spent for the cleanup has been to clean up RDX and its components?
That would be our program. The 1.4 billion number is for both programs, the Army to the north and the Air Force to the south. They're dealing with the fuels and solvents and now PFAS. Our program has spent, all told, about $600 million. And much of that is on investigation and cleanup of RDX.
Okay, so that leaves 600 million? So that leaves about 800 million. Do you happen to know what percentage of that 800 million was for fuel cleanup and the relative?
I would say it to be the rest of it.
The balance.
Yeah.
So let me ask you the final question. No, not final. Maybe the final question. What percentage of it has been used for cleanup relative to small arms?
We have
other than the 240,000 yards you took out, which you extracted 70 tons of lead from, which was more of a precautionary than necessary.
So for cleanup of groundwater from small arms, we haven't spent anything because we haven't found any contamination in the groundwater.
Exactly. Now, I understand that a lot of people have a political opposition to the military. Many of them don't even know why. It's just ingrained in them. But a lot of these people are people of science as well. And I haven't heard anybody with any science, with any weight whatsoever, as to why this should not proceed and go forward. Pardon the cheap puns, but they come here unarmed. They have no smoking gun. There is almost no, you have capture berms. You're using copper bullets. I mean, this is smokeless gunpowder. I mean, even if it did pollute, it could be collected in some sort of a mat or a thin layer. I mean, there's just absolutely zero chance that this is going to do any damage to the groundwater. And I remind you that most of the plumbing in most of our houses is copper. And I don't see any outcry for that. So I honestly don't see the need for this. And just one more thing. I have a friend who was the general, retired general. More than that, he's a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staffs.
That is your 3 minutes, Mark.
Yeah, and he pointed out to me the biggest thing is lack of training in the military causes the deaths of young men. And in Korea, he had a number that he put on it somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,000. And I think training is the ultimate importance, and I think it should be supported by everyone. Thank you.
Not on, but we do have a couple people that are still ahead of you. Sir, go ahead.
Just as, I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. I live here in Falmouth, and I've been here for about 10 years, so I guess I'm considered a wash ashore. My neighbor next door just bought a parcel of land. He clear-cut 2 acres of land. Conservation Commission had no say in how that was done, and now there's a consequence in the vernal right next. I'm here to stand in support of the machine gun range, not so much because I want to see our soldiers using more and more weapons, but sir, in respect to your tour of duty in Vietnam, a 25-year failed experience, and the one that we're experiencing right now, very easy way to do this is to stop sending our young men and women to these tolerable, unconscionable wars. But having said that, not giving them the tools that they need is equally unconscionable. And anyone that opposes that, you have to have a son that's been in Afghanistan. I got a great T-shirt from it. And my son says, Dad, what was that all about? I can't answer that question, which is shameful. So give them the tools they need. If it means a machine gun range, give them a machine gun range. Thank you very much.
My name's Steve Ellis. I live here in Falmouth. And one of my concerns is that as much as the military is trying to take in and do good for the country, for the soldiers to train and everything, a lot of the information that you have to base your decisions on and everything, it's the best we've got at this moment, but it's not necessarily what they're going to think is going on 5 or 10 years down the road. We see that a lot where environmentally we're trying to understand what's going on. They're trying to understand the sharks, they're trying to understand erosion, they're trying to understand, we're doing the best we can, and we're trying to do less pollution. But it's what we know at this moment that they're asking you to take and make your decisions on. And just like in medicine, you're told to do something today, but 5 years, 10 years down the road, they're not doing that anymore because they're thinking different about that situation. And that's my concern, that down the road, when we have better information, that some of this activity is going to be looked upon as we could have done a better job. And I appreciate the environment. I'm retired, and I like to be in the outdoors, and I like to try to help the community, and I like that the town tries their best to take and look at athletic fields or wind turbines or whatever they're doing. Homeowners, cut a tree, do whatever you're doing in an environmentally safe, considerate way. And I think that's a good thing. But when you're doing it on a scale the size of the Otis Air Force Base, you're environmentally, whether it's turtles or birds or whatever that are there that you're trying to be caring of, environmentally, we just got eagles coming back into the Cape. We don't know what we're doing. We're trying to take and do a better job. And all those little things that happen, that you're moving in the right direction, but you really can't even begin to understand all those little micro things that are going on. It's going to be there, and it's going to happen. Whatever that is, 5, 10 years down the road. We're taking cranberry bogs, we're trying to take and open them up to let the trout fish come back in. We're trying to do good things, but we're moving in that direction, but we don't really know what the end effect's going to be after 2 years or 5 years. We're waiting to see, and that's what I feel. Whatever happens, whether you get the rights to do it or not, we're going to be waiting, and we're going to be the recipients of it. Just like whatever happens here on the waterfront, the Army Corps engineers, they're trying to take care of the canal. Sandwich has had a huge problem. They're trying to do their best, but we're going to wait and find out what happens. And that's, for me, that's where we're going.
Just about out of time. Did you have a question? Okay.
Excuse me?
Just about out of time there.
No, that's all. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks.
So, and I'm going to let Jake McCumber address the habitat questions. And there may have been a question about maybe some chemistry in there and how much data and how long we've been studying, the constituents that exist with small arms ranges. So I'll let Dr. Mike Sranka speak to that. But it is something that we continue to look at. That is, the habitat, the groundwater, that is our charge. That is our priority. That is what we do. So we combine that with compatible military training.
We're going to take one from this side now, if we could. Sorry. Okay.
If I could just say one thing, it's, I don't need to get into the details on that, but that is exactly why we have such robust and extensive monitoring programs, not just in my field, but in all of the ranges and chemistry. So that's why we're doing so much soil sampling, water sampling, bird monitoring, moth monitoring, everything else, so that we have the data, we have the statistics. We work with statisticians so that we are sure that we have the sensitivity of our monitoring to detect change early and see concerns coming. All of that is getting reported to the scientists and regulators in our annual reports and our collaboration efforts. And that's why we have such a robust regulatory process around the base. So those early warning systems exist. As the science adapts, that's what science does. We have the data to respond and understand what's going on in our system.
So go ahead, ma'am, with your question. Oh, sorry.
Eventually.
If I can just follow up on Jake's comment there. One of the things with the Massachusetts Army National Guard is that we have to comply with all federal, state, and local regulations. And the regulatory compliance for this project doesn't end if this project gets ultimately approved or not. We still have to comply with all the regulations on a day-to-day basis from this point forward, and regulations continually change, and it's very difficult and challenging to keep up with all the changes as an agency. But that's one of the things that we have an office of really 22 people that are dedicated to the environmental stewardship for the Massachusetts Army National Guard. I just want to say that again, that we have to comply with all regulations from this point forever, really, and there's no change in that. So,
if you could just identify yourself for the record, sir.
Oh, it's Keith Driscoll.
Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for being here and trying to clarify all the issues. I want to thank you for your service to our country. I have a comment. I'm for this machine gun range. I think that we have to have a place to do this. We have to make sure our soldiers are outfitted or taught properly. But one thing I do have, I have a question about their suggestions. I think you already talked about the simulation, but what about Fort Devon? Why are you not looking into going there?
So some of our soldiers actually do train at Fort Devens. That is a Massachusetts training site, so on occasion we do train there. But it really comes down to how many ranges that we have, and do we have the amount of ranges for the force structure that needs to train there, right? So I know there's been discussion about the multipurpose machine gun range that they're proposing and trying to build at Fort Devens. That is built specifically for a force structure which they represent. It's not a National Guard base. It is a reserve base. And that is going to be a 4-lane MPMG. A standard MPMG is 10 lanes. They reduce scope because of the size of the base. They also are not going to they're not going to do a 1,500 meter because they don't have the space for it. It's only going to be 800 meters and it's 4 lanes. Built specifically for the force structure which trains there, which is majority reserve forces. The ranges that we're building is specifically for our force structure and those who train at our base. We also reduce scope. We reduce scope for several reasons. One, we've already briefed it. I'm not going to get into all the details, but we reduce scope as well. We went from 10 lanes to 8 lanes. We're asking up to 800 meters currently. So that is the reason why, we aren't going to Fort Devens. There's not enough space. There's not enough ranges. This type of range is a typical range for a base that can occupy it. So it's not an atypical range that you would just, it's some, range that you've never seen before. It is a grassy field with capture berms in it, which hosts a lot of plants and animals and fauna, like Jake McCumber has said. It's not a paved parking lot. It's not a shopping mall. That's not what it is. It's a large grassy field with long grass that's probably 8 to 12 inches tall, that has monarch butterflies, it has box turtles in it, it has deer on the fringe. If you go on our tour, you're likely to see all of those. So it's just, you gotta really, I gotta put it in context for you. And as far as simulations, we do use simulations often. It's part of our process. So it's not something that we've ignored, it's something that we've definitely put into it. But like Major McDonough has said, we have to do live fire training. It's critical, and by regulation, we have to do it.
The one thing I would add is machine gun fire is not new to the base, and we talked about it in the brief, but I just really need to highlight that because the folks that live in the community near Snake Pond are very familiar with soldier training. We fire usually on weekends from March to November, between 2 and 3 weekends a month. That's when we fire. And we've fired machine guns there since 2007. So the type of ranges that this range represents is firing the same ammunition, causing the same type of noise that has been in place since 2007. So I just want to be clear on that because I think it's lost on some of the comments here, and I understand it's a very complex topic. So thank you.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I know it takes a lot of time to put presentations together. I am extremely impressed by the number of studies that you've done and your willingness to answer questions. At the end of all of that, I will say I am still very much opposed to the expansion of the machine gun utilization. I'll call it the expansion since you've been saying that it's been going onward. It seems to me that there must be places that it could be done or that could be rethought that would not be on top of an aquifer. That's the big issue, I think. I also have questions about the noise. I certainly have questions about the trees coming down, and yes, I'm very appreciative of the environmental studies, but at the end of the day, I guess I feel like if all these studies that you've been doing for years and years with collaboration from these other environmental organizations, if they were so very clear, then why are there so many organizations that are still opposed to it? I'm not a scientist, so I haven't gone through every single study and compared. But there's a lot of scientists on the other side, it seems. And so
I think that's problematic. And I guess when it comes down to something as fundamental as drinking water, I would err on the side of let's not do something that has a danger to ruin the water we drink. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Pete. I'm a chemistry teacher in Barnstable, and I have a PhD in science. And I was a scientist until I became a public school teacher here on the Cape. The question I have is related to unintended consequences, of course, which we're all very familiar with here, given the history of the base. Unfortunately, I'm a hunter as well. Lead presents a problem for human health, whether it's in our pipes or whether it gets in our groundwater. Okay, so we're not doing lead anymore. We figured that one out a little bit late for some. So my question arises now for copper. Yes, I got copper pipes. Being an aquatic scientist, I am aware, though, that copper does present a problem to aquatic systems. So my question is, are you at all worried, or have you studied the effects of our rain here on the Cape, which is acidic, the lack of buffer in our ground soils, and the potential for the leaching of copper into our aquatic systems, and the effect that it could potentially have on organisms, not humans, but on organisms? Thank you very much for allowing me to ask this.
So thank you for that question. I'm going to pass that off to a couple people, but maybe three. But Dr. Mike Steranka, I know you've had an ad hoc study on these effects, and Jake, you might have some comments as well.
Mike Steranka for the record. I don't know what specific question to answer, but what I can tell, I'll address several of them. With lead in our soils here, our soils are pretty static in their pH. They're also pretty static in their capacity to bind lead with iron. With copper, it's calcium that acts like the iron and binds it, and along with our pH, it's even less mobile than lead in soils, and we have yet to find anything mobilizing past 3 inches for copper, and I believe it was at 12 feet for lead, but still at background levels for that. Maybe I'm addressing that. For those of you that ask that we have to change with the times and adapt with changing environmental issues and techniques and monitoring, we've done that. We've been firing since 2007, and we have operations, maintenance, and monitoring plans for each range. And since 2007, we've changed those plans approximately 17 times to keep up with the change in technology, change in monitoring. And we have an ad hoc committee of the Science Advisory Council, the Environmental Management Commission. And if we have any specific issue, it's very difficult in the Science Advisory Council's meeting to discuss a specific issue. So we do have an ad hoc committee of MIT scientists, chemists, one from Wentworth Institute, and he's another chemist. We have USGS, Dennis LeBlanc, most of you know him. And we have a guy from the Coal Regions Research Lab up in New Hampshire, Jay Clausen. And they sit and discuss specific issues. Also, what I can tell you is we have action levels for detection in soil, and we also measure pore water about 2 feet down. When the rain hits the soil, we have a bucket collection through that soil to see if anything's percolating through the water as an early warning system. We have action levels, but we don't wait for things to reach action levels. If we see any remote increase in substances, particularly lead, antimony, and copper, there is a change, an increase in those concentrations. We immediately inform our regulatory oversight partners. We also inform the ad hoc committee, and we discuss it. And I can give you a recent example. Antimony became mobile in soil in our lysimeters, and that was around 2009. We spent the next 5 years researching to find out what happened there. Well, the regulatory community requested that we line the ranges. Coal Region Research Lab did chemical column studies, which then found out that the phosphates put in the soil bind lead and our liming and increase the mobility of antimony in soil. Thank God it only went to 2 feet and would rebind in the soil, but that's the chemistry, how well we know the chemistry here, and we do have experts way beyond our capabilities to assess this in an early fashion. We do not want to be in the position of cleaning up anything in the future. As far as cleaning up the bullets, Major McDonough did say that we do have capture berms. On each of these ranges, we do a line of sight analysis so we can capture the vast majority of these rounds, and then at an appropriate time that's coordinated with our regulatory community, we will harvest them from the capture berms and remove them from the range. These ranges used to be fire forget ranges for the military, and we're having an impact all the way across the country. I had Fort McCoy contact me this week so that they can talk to us on how to modernly manage ranges. So years ago, we used to fire and forget. There were no capture berms. We didn't even know the footprint of the range. Now our ranges are isolated. We know where the things are. We monitor, report those findings to you all and to the scientific community, regulatory community, so that we can be informed and not impact the aquifer. Hopefully I addressed the question.
Okay. Before we go tonight, I just wanted to respond to Colonel Porter's suggestion that we used loaded language or inaccurate language. And if we did, that was unintentional. We are not paid experts. We're just citizens who care very deeply about our water. And it is not an easy lift to get members of the public to read this environmental assessment, as so many of them have, to think about it and submit their questions to you. So many good questions have been raised during this process that there is reason for this to get an independent study. And that's what we have been calling for all along, an independent study, an environmental impact statement. On the subject of the PFAS, I did not suggest that PFAS would emanate from the gun range. I was very careful to be clear that it was U.S. Air Force activities. And, but to the public, it's all the base, you know. And so my point was that base activities, U.S. Air Force activities, have resulted in PFAS in Mashpee's water, and the $8.5 million price tag is going to be left to the citizens. And this is the kind of scenario that we need to avoid in the future, and we're concerned about. So, and Susan Rickman, right before me, made the point I wanted to make and have, you know, I wish she had the last word, but we feel that these questions have been raised, and the base is putting your training needs over the concerns of the public on a project that introduces new risks to our water supply. We understand the risks in the world. We want you to be prepared. We just don't want this on our protected water supply. It's not where it belongs. Thank you all very much.
Hello, my name is Rebecca Webb. I grew up in Falmouth and have returned later in life to live in West Falmouth. I also live in Rochester, New York, about an hour away from Buffalo. First, just a comment that's maybe a little bit directed at our select people, and that is I do have concerns about this location, and it's easy to say not in my backyard. In my case, I have two backyards. One is here, one is in Western New York. This particular backyard on Cape Cod, there's many aspects of this project which would seem to fly in the face of this being a tourist location that draws people from up and down the eastern seaboard. In fact, it even draws them from Rochester, New York, where they have to drive 7 to 8 hours to get here. People come for the natural beauty. They come for the quiet. I'm concerned about the removing of 170 acres of trees, because that does not seem consistent with the money that the government and the small towns up and down the East Coast are putting into preparation for sea rise and climate change. There's an issue of traffic as well. If this will increase the activity on the base by 18%, a number I heard earlier, or by whatever percent that is, that will be more traffic as well. And really the livelihood of this entire little delicate piece of land depends on tourism. There's my comments, but I have a specific question, and that is, I sort of grew up thinking about animals and plants in a kind of simplified way, you know, that they needed space and they needed food and water. But more and more, and I'm not a scientist, we've become more aware of the effect of, let's say, light pollution on the reproductive and the migratory behaviors of animals. Case in point, well, what I'm thinking about actually is partly light pollution, but especially sound. And so my question is this: as part of the extensive studies that looked into the impact of this project on the wildlife, and this is land designated to protect wildlife habitat, as well as the water, to what extent have these studies looked at the impact of the noise from the machine gun raised sound? Thank you.
So as far as the regulatory review process, there wasn't a whole lot specific to that, but that's largely because we've done so much monitoring around the ranges. So we were able to look at, say, the bird populations around the ranges. And just one example is a migratory study that we've done with Mass Wildlife for the last 4 years, looking at the whippoorwills surrounding India Range. And for instance, you know, just one of those birds has nested each year within about 3 meters of the same location right behind India Range, raised the nest each year, and gone to wintering grounds and nested in the same location. You know, so like there's abundant anecdotes like that that show the strong acclimatization of wildlife to noise. And then there's the types of things that I mentioned earlier. You know, it's important to remember that over half of the state-listed species we manage on the base that are regulated by Mass Wildlife are insects, for instance. And of course, insects do use sound. Everybody that can hear the katydids and the crickets out right now knows they must be using that. They absolutely are. But the range use noise is episodic and generally fairly limited. And we see through all of our studies that the wildlife is adapted to it. So whether you're talking big game charismatic fauna like deer, or whether you're talking about New England cottontails that are using the edges of the ranges and going back and forth between the grassy openings and the managed pine barrens forests, or you're talking about the frosted elfin or the frosted elfin butterfly, excuse me, or the monarch, or punctured tiger beetle, or all these other things that we're managing for, we see resilience and a lack of impact from the range use. And like I said before, the ranges are our biodiversity hotspots and the focus of a lot of the research with Mass Wildlife and others. And that certainly wouldn't be the case if the range noise was problematic for our ecosystem or those fauna.
Hi, Chris Liptak. I'm a Falmouth resident. I wanted to thank the JBCC staff for coming out and giving a fairly detailed brief. Obviously, you've done a lot of work on this. It's taken a long time. I wanted to thank the 350 group for raising a lot of alternative concerns and such. I don't think this necessarily has to be adversarial. I think that was all very good stuff. The question I have for Colonel Porter and his staff is, it came up, it's 170 acres of clear cutting, but I think when I was looking through the documents online, is there a mitigation or a carbon reforestation plan that's part of that? And that's my question.
So I'm going to turn this over to Jake McCumber. He's probably definitely the resident expert on all of this.
So it is 170 acres of tree clearing. As part of our site selection process, we were looking at the habitat conditions of the areas we were analyzing as alternatives. It's not, mature, mature oak forest or anything in that area, so that's beneficial as far as looking at climate impacts and what areas we would choose to clear. But it is important that the range itself, we've committed in our long-term planning, but also specifically for the range to plant the range in native grasses and forbs. So it'll be wildflowers and grasses, which themselves will be sequestering carbon. But most importantly, there's about 5,000 acres of mitigation zones that we have established as part of our conservation and management permit with Mass Wildlife. So that was done most specifically for wildlife habitat, but then it carries with it those climate benefits from the perpetual protections provided under the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act. So about 1,200 of those 5,000 acres is closed canopy forest protection, which we committed to do for box turtles, because box turtles have a complex life history, and in particular their hibernation will be in more mature forest areas. And so we have 1,200 acres of set aside that we're explicitly managing for a mature closed forest condition. And then in addition, the remainder of that, the 3,800 acres, is our Pine Barrens habitat improvement zones, which are particularly focused on projects that will increase climate resilience and make for much healthier forest stand structure.
And just to add to that, so phase 1 and phase 2 is 170 acres. We're asking for, just phase 1 currently from the EMC, which is approximately 100 acres. I know it's a little nuanced, but keep in mind that we're managing for the whole entire mitigation for the entire project. So in 3, 5, 10 years, whenever we receive funding for the second phase, the mitigation had already taken place. That carbon sequestration from that mitigation has already taken place. We've already built it into the plan. So it's just forward thinking on, on our part of what we want to do in the future. And we're already accounting for it with our actions today.
My name is Eleanor Ling. I'm from Falmouth, Precinct 1. Thank you very much for being here tonight to answer our questions and address our concerns. As many people in this audience, I'm also concerned about the negative impact of the Seoul aquifer. And also, I'm also, concerned about clear cutting of 170 acres of trees and the proposed mitigation by the Joint Base. I have several questions, and the first question is, it's not clear to me. Well, first, I'm very glad to hear that EPA is going to do a review. Now, my understanding is that they're going to do a review. Is it reviewing of the existing data that JBCC has done, and it is not really a new independent study? That is my first question. And the second question is, if it is a review of your existing data and conclusion, how long is the review process? And I like to comment that the 170 acres of clear cutting of trees will really, well, in my opinion, have negative impact on our climate, because even if you transfer several hundred acres of forested land to the Crane Reservation area, we still lose a net carbon sequestration and carbon storage capability. So my question to you is, would you consider other mitigation options, such as, for example, set up a fund for the towns, or for example, Falmouth, Mashpee, Bonn, Sandwich, so that the towns can use those funds to, let's say, for example, put solar, rooftop solar panels on public schools, buildings, on public parking lot, carport solar rooftop, carport solar systems, and also use the funds to install charging infrastructure for electrical vehicle and e-bikes and so forth. Because to me, I want to emphasize, this is only my view, of course. To me, that is more meaningful mitigation than just transferring several hundred acres of trees. Because you have,
excuse me,
you
ma'am,
know, a lot
that
of
is the
trees.
3 minutes.
Okay.
If you're finished with your question.
I can finish. I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Good question. Two of those questions I'm going to turn over to my team here. But the last question, would we consider mitigation options such as funds for solar, for public buildings, for surrounding towns and communities? That might be difficult just on how the money works, but what I would recommend, and what I've always said, and what our team certainly stands behind. I know Jake was definitely part of the Climate Action Plan working group, but there's goals, and we want to work towards those goals too. So if there are projects that we can do on the base in order to reduce footprint or carbon footprint, then certainly we're all for it, and we're already doing it. But I'd love to hear additional ideas and be part of that conversation. I think that's important, and we do get funds for that. That's a big priority for the government as well, for the DoD. So we're definitely would like to be part of that conversation. I'll turn the other two questions over to for a sole source aquifer review. That's going to be definitely in Keith Driscoll's line.
Sorry. I appreciate your questions and your comments, and I really enjoyed your ideas for mitigation. I think Colonel Porter answered that correctly there. If I can go back to your original question about the EPA review, and that's known as the Sole Source Aquifer Review, that we just received a letter, the Adjutant General of the Massachusetts Army National Guard received on Monday, that they would like us to go through the Sole Source Aquifer Review, which we did consult with them about a year ago in regards to whether that review was applicable to us or not. And their initial reaction was, no, they're not, because there was a military exemption. But it has come up again. Here we are a year later, where EPA feels that they'd like to see that review, and they have every right to ask for it, and we agreed to it. And I just started consulting with them again. I found out Monday, started with the phone calls on Monday evening about what is required from us. And we have not received a list of, they're putting together a list of all the data that they're going to request from us. It will be the most recent data, if that's, I think that was one of your questions, was if it's going to be recent data. Yes, it will be recent data. It will incorporate all the information about the design of the range that we have, the location. I'm sure they're going to do some scientific modeling or computer modeling with all the information that they're going to get from us and all the information they're going to pull together that they already have, because EPA has been on the base working with Ben and his crew since 1997, and there's an awful lot of data that they have, and I'm sure they can consider all that, but ultimately whatever they ask for, we'll provide to the best to our ability, and we're going to work together through this. I think there was the timeline question, how long this is going to take. I asked that too, because I've never been part of a sole source aquifer review. So Their initial response was, oh, it could be a couple months. When I hear a couple months, I think it's going to take longer than that, which, you know, I think 2 months is ambitious. It's with you. But the review will be publicized when it's done, you know, because everything we do is public and it's a public document. And I'm sure EPA will release the results at, you know, once everyone's had a chance to review it and take a look at it. So I hope I answered your question there. Okay.
Lilia Franton, North Falmouth, Precinct 5 town meeting member. My comment is I'm opposed to the rifle range because of its negative impact on the community and on the environment. But my question is to the select board. Like all of us, you've been sitting here listening, but you have an additional power, and I'm wondering what you intend to do with everything that you've heard tonight. And you may not be able to or want to answer that right now. You might want to do this at the end. But I'm very concerned about what will come from this meeting and from the comments, in particular from the public.
Well, we haven't said it yet on a future agenda, but we will, and we'll take it up as a discussion. Taking in what we've heard tonight, both from the Joint Base Cape Cod, the 350 group, and the public with their questions. So we'll take it in as a whole and discuss it as a board and vote whether we feel like we can support the project or if we feel like we should not. So that'll be our future.
It feels so liberating to take that mask off. My name is Judy Fenwick. I worked for 33 years at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, a great deal of that time on policy issues surrounding climate change, and 3 years, but not most recently, at the Woodwell Climate Research Center, also attending the International UN Climate Conference over a period of 15 years. So I'm not a scientist, but I've worked on policy, so it's a soft science. So far this evening, you folks from Joint Base Cape Cod have presented what I consider a very reasoned presentation on what you need in the form of a machine gun range. And over the past year, many people in our community have raised concerns and questions on an outcome they want from the Joint Base Cape Cod gun range. So I would say you've presented your needs, and some of us have presented our wants. I understand that compromise is often a pejorative word when you're weighing needs versus wants, or when you're weighing the needs of the military with the wants of a community. You folks tend to have more weight. So I'm just curious how far each side might have to travel to come to some form of compromise. I know that's more of a rhetorical question than you can answer this evening.
So I'm not exactly sure how I'd answer that question, except conversation and, you know, communicating with the public is definitely a way forward on anything we do. So, like I said earlier, I'm definitely, and we are definitely open to the conversation for sure.
Hi, I'll be really quick. Before the night is over, I appreciate Chairman Brown, the reference to 350 Cape Cod, the group that I lead, but also this presentation was a joint effort between organizations at the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative, APCC, the Sierra Club, Coalition for Social Justice, Faith Communities Environmental Network. So I just wanted to make that clear. It's a very large coalition of us.
Okay, thank you for that.
Good evening. I'm Steve Tom. I live in Falmouth, and I just have a question for, if you want to call it, both sides. Clearly, the Joint Base has done a huge amount of science and research to not only for this project, but as part of your agenda, as your environmental and conservation agenda. So congratulations. I know that on the environmental side, all of the organizations that Rosemary just commented on have tremendous scientific resources. There's been criticism this evening that there's not enough specifics. Quite frankly, if you load me down with scientific specifics, it goes right over my head. The public needs an interpretation of the facts, and I would urge the military establishment to partner with the environmental establishment to work through the disagreements, lack of understanding, lack of information, and work towards a common goal of how can we make this happen safely. If not, if that can't happen, what can happen safely, rather than argue at some of the levels we've had tonight. I don't see the value in the argument. I see the value in working together and coming up with a solution.
I can applaud that one. And we have a couple of questions from our board, if we could, sir.
Good evening. For the record, my name is Angela Scott Price, Falmouth Select Board. Gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you for your service. It is greatly appreciated, so I know everybody in the room. And thank you for being with us on an especially difficult day, as been mentioned before. So thank you. Did have a couple questions, one of which I want to ask the first part of the question to make sure that I have my facts straight before asking the follow-up part. I read somewhere, and admittedly I don't remember where I read it, that part of the reasoning for putting this machine gun expansion on Joint Base Cape Cod is to keep the base relevant in some capacity, to ensure that some of the jobs stay on the base. And so before I follow up with my question, I want to ask, is that accurate?
Ma'am, that is not accurate. The base is relevant. It will continue to be relevant. It's a training requirement. That's the prime. We need this range for a training requirement to train our soldiers.
Okay, thank you. Second question, not related. If this is to be permitted and the expansion is to be put on the range, excuse me, as mentioned earlier, there was discussion about that there would be monitoring, and if anything were to happen, that there would be mitigation. So I'm curious, let's say the range is expanded and there is some sort of issue that comes up. What is the protocol for remediation, mitigation, and potential timelines for if you need to stop activity or move activity, or just what is the process?
So I'm going to turn this over to Major McDonough for plans and training, and then also Dr. Mike Saranka is going to have some comments as well. And it all depends on what it is specifically you're talking about. If it's contamination, if you're specifically talking about that, or for anything else, but it's really anything with the EPSs or Chapter 19, we can go over a couple examples.
So just to reintroduce the topic, we have an operations, maintenance, and monitoring plan for each of our ranges, and it details how that range is supposed to be used, how it's supposed to be maintained, and then all the testing regimens that go into it. And what I'd like to do when I hand it off to Mike is talk about a success story for that, which was the very brief use of the tungsten round. So that was a round that was presented as environmentally safe in the 90s, and we tried to use it, and the testing almost immediately alerted us to an issue, which Mike can talk more about because that was before my time, but that's a really good example of how the system and how the monitoring work on our ranges.
Again, Mike Saranka.
Turn it on.
Again, Mike Saranka. Actually, Ben would probably be better to talk for the tungsten, so I'll leave it to him. I'll mess it up and say something wrong. But as far as the process, if we identify something that has gone wrong early in our monitoring, if I notice something, I gave you the example of the antimony earlier. As soon as I noticed that was approaching our action level, we are required within our operations, maintenance, and monitoring plan, if it trips the action level, not if it approaches it, but we do this anyway because we regularly talk to our regulatory partners. But we contact them. They then come out, do an inspection to make sure that there's nothing imminent and substantial danger to any kind of a system, the soil, anything. If they do identify that it is, we will shut the range down. We can shut a lane down. We can shut the range down. Any of those scenarios that need. So The priority is the environment. So as soon as we notice something, we report it. If it's serious enough, we shut the range down. But we've never had to do that before. We have reported increases in our pore water, like I told you, that's the rainwater percolating through the soil. That's something extra we do. It's not a regulatory requirement. Some of the scientists question its validity and its valid nature, but we want the earliest warning that we can get if something's wrong. So yes, there is a complete process for addressing any issue that comes up, and the primary thing is we stop using the range if we have any question. Does that answer the question, hopefully? You're welcome.
Thank you all for being here with us tonight. I really appreciate that. I want a point of clarification. Did I hear, and this follows up on what Dr. Ling had brought up, that the EPA is going to be looking and reviewing the work that the Army has done? The studies and is that correct?
So the EPA, and I'll let Keith talk to this, but the EPA has overall authority. They can review whatever they want regarding the sole source aquifer and their program. They've been involved in the program in our water cleanup since the early 90s, and I'm sure they're certainly going to be reviewing our data and data that they've also created, and potentially, if they want, taking more tests. But I'll let Keith talk a little bit more.
Yeah, so I'll clarify that the EPA has been involved in this project since the beginning, since the beginning of the environmental process. So we sent them the state environmental review documents, the notice of project change, and then the supplemental environmental impact report. Then we also sent them a letter pre-development of the environmental assessment, which is part of the National Environmental Policy Act, which is the federal version of the state MEPA process. So we asked them for their concerns, to identify any concerns they may have with the range. We sent them, what rough layouts that we did have of the range. They sent their comments back. We incorporated their comments into the actual EA that went on, that ultimately went out for public review, and then we received more comments from them, and we answered their comments in the comment matrix that's provided. So
Thank you.
they were involved right from the beginning.
And so my second question is, would Joint Base Cape Cod be open to a third-party independent environmental look?
As in what form of review? Is it so? Maybe I can answer this differently. Yeah. I was going to say, so when we developed both of these completed both of these environmental processes, both the state and the federal version, there's a checks and balance system that's built into the process. We developed the document to the best of our ability. We hire contractors to do independent studies that are needed to support the document. We send those documents out to our stakeholders, to our regulators. We get their input on them. So the document that everybody reads at the end has had many eyes on it, many eyes outside of our agency, both federal, state, and local. And we also open it up to the public too, to ask for their comment as well. And then we incorporate all their comments into them. So that was for both the state process and for both the federal process as well. I'm sure, I'm sure if there's other environmental reviews, the independent reviews, then, we can't stop that, So, yeah.
And so I just want to ask one more time. I briefly asked this at our meeting the last time I saw you, Colonel Porter, and I know you weren't prepared to address it at that time. But ironically, this week I received a comment from somebody who, not sure if they're a scientist, but it was the same concern that I had. And not being a scientist myself, I just was thinking it seemed like it would be a wise idea to put down some sort of a containment capture area along the firing line. The person who sent the comment today would be 150 or 150 meters or whatever it was, 50 meters behind the line and 100 in front of it. I don't know what that would be, maybe a poly tarp under the surface just to ensure that any of the propellants were being captured. And I'm wondering if that's something that would be should be considered, and if it would be considered, or is it already part of the plan?
I'll answer your question. Just to put a little perspective for you, at the beginning when we returned to live fire in 2007, there was a formation of the Small Arms Range Working Group, and that consisted of Mass DEP, the EPA, the EMC, and the Mass Guard. And part of what that working group was to do was to address those types of things and come up with any kind of bullet capture systems, et cetera, and so forth. So to keep it short for interest of time, we've gone through a full cycle of bullet traps. You guys know we had a STAP system for capturing lead bullet traps. Believe it or not, more of an environmental concern than the lead bullets themselves. We tested that STAP system prior to utilizing it, and there was more chemistry in that STAP system than our bullets would have ever put on the ground. So we were constant fear of fire and it rupturing onto the ground, so we are so happy to get rid of that. So we've gone through the process of evaluating these types of things. At the firing line, you do have muzzle blast. And in our muzzle blast, there is the propellant in for the bullet is a nitroglycerin propellant, which the bugs in the soils will eat nitroglycerin up. The concern is in the primer of the muzzle blast. The primer of the bullet that sets off the propellant to shoot the bullet has lead and antimony within the primer. A de minimis amount, but we still monitor for it. On the machine gun range, that will be even further important to monitor for at the firing line, because if you think about a machine gun fire, now, so that I get this right, you guys correct me if I'm wrong, on the small machine gun, it's 3 to 5 round bursts. On our larger machine guns, it's 6 to 9 round bursts. There's never a scenario where guys are out on a range with a machine gun with a trigger pulled and they're shooting belts of ammunition like off TV. That is just absolutely absurd and ridiculous. Waste ammunition, it's not proper training. And his training tables do have a set number of rounds to be used. So when a machine gun range blasts, 3 round burst, you get 3 quick pops out of the muzzle, and those clouds can come together and drop down onto the ground. So we spend extra monitoring soils, core water, that's the one I told you about earlier at the firing line, to ensure that we're not getting any kind of buildup at the firing line or percolation, subsurface percolation. EPS 19 is the one that guides that. However, we do that to begin with. The firing line, interestingly enough, is where we've got no detections of lead or antimony or constituents of concern. It's mainly right at the target line, and we don't get propellant buildup on the firing line, but we continue to test for it. And we have thought about laying mats down for things, but it's not a practical solution to it, because you can get rain to wash it off, and then we start concentrating contaminants, and then you get point sources. So there's a whole complex history and research in that, and our Small Arms Range Working Group that included outside independent entities would evaluate that. So what we've come to is managed earthen berms, right back to the chemistry that I discussed earlier, where the USGS was imploring us not to adjust the chemistry, but the regulators wanted us to, and it wound up with an issue. So we like I said, we try to stay on top of the science, and with the regulators, we bring them with us in a partnering fashion, like somebody said, so that we can get the best protection for our systems here. We all live here. I don't want to dirty the environment. I was 8 years old. I put 80 oil-soaked ducks in my parents' garage. I don't want to hurt the aquifer. Okay? So hopefully that answers your question, sir.
That was a very good answer. The one last thing is, could you just address the tracer rounds and whether or not they're a threat more than the regular rounds?
Yes, the tracer rounds on this range, tracers are rarely used there because we have such a fire issue. So Major McDonough, who's also our acting range control officer, is very conservative with the use of tracers on post. However, tracers do have a lot of phosphorus in them, and our main concern is the fire aspect of the tracers, starting wildfires. So as far as the chemistry, no chemistry there that we are deeply concerned with that we are monitoring for. There's no perchlorate in the tracer. Depending on the color, it's various chemistry constituents within the tracer. I believe it's red, usually, or white, and strontium something makes red, and I can't remember what makes white. Yeah, and any of these training aids or new rounds, this copper munition, has to go through review. There is a munitions review with the EMC process, and we have to provide them the data. So I have access to a Midas database that is so detailed in the breakdown of the bullet itself that it gives me even the shellac on the cartridge of what the shellac on the cartridge of the shell casing is made out of. So they get that information. So it breaks it down where you can see any of the contaminants that may be in a round, to include the metals, what the metals are made of. So it's a brass, and it breaks down what brass is made of in this detailed sheet. So we have a very detailed process of tracking the chemistry, what we need to monitor, and we try to stay current with the latest technology and the sensitivity for testing. That's the big thing. Even with the PFAS, that's continued to get more sensitive and more sensitive. So even with our tests, we're having to reduce our detection limits because the tests are being more sensitive and more sensitive. So, and your state, we have some of the best state regulators in the country here, and they are on top of that stuff, and they make us aware of it before. Sometimes we're meeting each other, making each other aware of it, but they initiate that immediately. Ben spoke to 200 milligrams per kilogram for lead in soils. We had already removed it down to the state standards, but they came and asked us, we changed our standards, will you take it back down? Yes, we want to protect the aquifer. Hopefully that answers your question.
It certainly does. Thank you very much. And
So I just had one point of clarification to add. So tracer rounds have already gone through that analysis that Mike described and have been approved. The only restrictions that are on them are internally based on weather conditions. So a lot of ranges nationwide watch weather monitoring, and I work with Jake's team on that. And if the fire risk is high enough, we don't allow the use of tracer fire. So that's common practice in the Army. But just to highlight what Mike said, every type of ammunition that is fired on the base has to be pre-approved. It goes through a very detailed process that Mike went through, and we would not fire it unless it were approved.
And just one last thing too, just, and not to labor the point, but we are definitely open to ideas of how to improve our ranges too. So a lot of these ideas that we have came from, our working groups, whether it's our range officers, but also working with the EMC environmental officer as well. Things such as, using Durablock as a means of capturing rounds. Would that work? So we've experimented on whether that would work. So the idea, maybe not specifically that idea, but stuff like that is stuff that they think about, and if it makes sense and we test it out and it works, we use it.
well, I certainly appreciate you gentlemen coming here this evening. It's very enlightening. And if there's no more questions, I guess we're going to wrap it up. And I'd like to thank you very much for coming. I think you deserve a round of applause for being here.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.